Hey, folks, thanks for joining me for this episode of the Embellish Podcast, a podcast focused on product stories, product storytellers, interesting brand ambassadors, and any other tangent that I happen to come up with. Whether you're a bourbon fan, a geek, a casual observer, or someone just floating through this channel, I hope you find it interesting. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully, I can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. And if you can't find me on a platform, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com and I'll try to get that taken care of. Also generally live stream the recording of these episodes on YouTube, and you can find all of my links on Instagram at embellishpod or Twitter with the same handle. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's a place to pick up these links, episode details, and more. Today is July the 18th. It's Monday, and we are talking with Jake from Starward, from Key in the Lake, from all things whiskey infamous. And I realize I probably should have cut out the whether you're a bourbon fan, just a whiskey fan in general, because you kind of seem to be that guy. And I'll start with this. It feels like the first interview that I did was with Chris Blattner from Urban Bourbonist / Bourbon Charity / whatever else, another Chicago resident, and you. And so I've bookended these interviews with two of the most beautiful men that I can. I feel like maybe I need to move to Chicago and have some of that rub off on me. I don't know what it is about you folks. You're just so damn pretty.
It's in the dirty Lake Michigan water. All that stream.
I wondered that.
That stream of lusciousness that flows right through the middle of the city and the river. Man, you can't go kayaking in there without getting sick and growing some hair.
And I imagine it may also help, kind of boost up your immune system, just being around that level of water. I was actually up there back at the beginning or end of May, beginning of June. I can't remember, for work. We have an office that's working in the downtown area. And, it is a beautiful city. Absolutely is a beautiful city. And it's significantly better than the rural reaches of Western Kentucky, where there's not a ton of things to do. Most everything closes at 9 p.m. We're not used to that type of atmosphere.
I hear you on that. No, I grew up in Iowa, what I called the Golden Abyss. Golden for the corn that was surrounding us at all areas of life. And if you lived in a city like I did in Des Moines, because you go 5 minutes out the city and you're in a cornfield in any direction. And then the abyss was people kind of getting stuck in that structure of life, or graduate high school, go to college. By 30, you have a couple kids. Wasn't really for me, so I got out as soon as possible.
Yeah, it's definitely a regional viewpoint. We don't have, we have a good quantity of corn here, but we're in the boot of Kentucky, and we have a lot of tobacco. That is our big thing. And so you grow up with maybe not that bright green, but a darker green that, it's all the wonderful things of nicotine and smoke, and just it's either corn for whiskey or tobacco for smoking. But, we're going to kill you one way or the other if you're from the state of Kentucky.
I hear that.
So you work for Starward. Maybe that's a good place to start. That's where I know you from specifically. There's been a host of different special events or fundraisers where you've donated bottles. I've been at private tastings that you've hosted. I've got 3 bottles here that you've helped me acquire over time. I actually had 4, and I gave one of them away because that's what you do with whiskey. You make sure other people kind of understand the things. But tell me about Starward a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks again for just having me. I'm glad I could follow up Chris. Chris is becoming like the next host of our podcast, always the fill-in guy. If my other 2, whatever, friends, jagoffs, good mates, can't show up to the podcast, Chris is always there, a call away and ready to answer that call. But Starward's an amazing distillery out of Melbourne, Australia. So I've been working for the brand now for a little over 3.5 years. Hard to believe. Yeah, no sense of time either after COVID. So it's been a ride.
There's that 2 years of just whatever happened, man.
Yep. It's like, Jake, today you're not our brand ambassador anymore. You're just doing marketing. You're a photographer. You're a graphic designer. You're whatever. At this point, I'm just thankful I had a job the entire time, and, got to keep working for the brand. But back to the brand itself, it's a single malt distillery based out of Melbourne, Australia. Been in operation for just over 15 years now. And there's a lot of different ways you can create whiskey. A lot of people just think, why is there so many brands out there when you're just kind of recreating the wheel of something else? So our founder took it upon himself, his name's Dave Vitale, to start a brand that was introducing the world to Australia pure through and through, inside the bottle and on the outside the bottle too, where we take local farmers and develop our grain, develop our yeast strain with them. And then we put all of our whiskey inside of used red wine casks from Australian vineyards. Australian red wines are kind of the best known product when it comes to the alcohol world. And what our founder thought about doing was, why not integrate that into our whiskey and not overwhelm the whiskey with this really sweet, juicy flavor you get from the red wines out there, but kind of integrate it very softly and find the balance between a new single malt, but also exploring the full maturation inside of red wine casks. So that unique approach, that innovative approach that they have as a brand on the outside, on the inside of the bottle, but also the outside of the bottle with the beautiful branding. If you've ever seen a bottle of Starward, it's one of the prettiest bottles out there. Really attracted me as a graphic designer, photographer, creative type, but then also somebody who works in whiskey. So right away, it was kind of just a home run, as we're the night of the home run derby. No pun intended.
Hey, well played. You're able to kind of seamlessly weave that right into it. I mean, being from Chicago, it's a requirement. I assume that if you're from Chicago and you're not from the 2 blocks immediately surrounding White Sox Stadium, you're a Cubs fan, right?
Pretty much. I grew up a Cubs fan, weirdly. I mean, a lot of people from Iowa are, just because of WGN back in the day, and only being a 5-hour drive, 4-hour drive, depending where you're at in the great state of Iowa. Go Hawks. Everyone's kind of a Cubs fan in that sense, but I grew up in all Chicago sports, and my dad's from Cleveland. My mom could care less about sports. So how I developed this fascination for teams that were involved Bears somehow. That's what it was. I just loved Bears as a kid. So I became a Bears fan instantaneously. My first Halloween costume I can never remember was a Jim Harbaugh costume, quarterback number 4. Yeah, so one of my favorites out there. He actually was coaching. I went to a school called Drake in Des Moines for college, and he was coaching University of San Diego, their football team, before he went to Stanford. So they were playing them, and it was pouring down rain. But me and my buddies, they're also from Chicago. I was from Iowa, obviously, but we stood in the pouring rain, waited till after the game to go say hi to Jim Harbaugh, shake his hand, maybe get an autograph. He wasn't that friendly enough to give us an autograph, but shook our hands and said hi. And we're like, well, that was worth sitting in the rain for 3 hours. But yeah, so to answer your question, yes, I'm a Cubs fan. Was actually just at the Cubs game on Saturday night, watching them lose in a doubleheader, back-to-back games in one day and extra innings. Going down to the Mets.
And I won't lie. I knew the Cubs thing just because of Instagram. You posted a picture, you're wearing a Cubs hat. But here in town, I live in rural Western Kentucky in a small town, small university town, and we've got a guy that owns a restaurant downtown called Muggsy's, and he actually moved here from Chicago. He actually funded his restaurant by selling his 3-story home that was within walking distance of White Sox Stadium, and the revenue from that was enough to buy a home here and a restaurant and live. That's the cost of living difference. But spent quite a bit of time eating at his restaurant because I like to eat. It's a wonderful thing to do.
Yeah.
And he kind of gives me the same feedback that a lot of my friends from Chicago and college had was, you're either a Cubs fan or you're a White Sox fan if you lived right near the stadium. It's sort of kind of the way that kind of plays out. So you work for Starward, and maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. You tell me what the real deal is, because you work in the industry. It feels like in the last 6 months, Starward is gaining more and more traction in North America at a speed a little bit better than maybe the year before that. And I know we're also talking about COVID times. COVID times confabulate everything. It's really kind of hard to understand what happens, but I've seen more press, more positive input, more reviews, more everything around Starward.
Yeah, I think they're definitely onto that. I mean, the numbers show it. I believe we're up 60% in sales from last year to this year for our calendar year that ended on June 30th. But yeah, I think people are starting to figure out that whiskey's being made outside of America, Scotland, Ireland, and Japan, and realizing there's really good whiskey being made in all parts of the world. And I think Starward falls right in there. That was one of our goals when we first launched in the US, was not just to be a contender in the US market, but to be the beacon of light, if you will, for world whiskey, and be number 1 on those trending boards for world whiskey, which usually means any whiskey made outside of the United States, Canada, Japan, or not Japan, but not Australia either, but Ireland and the kind of the UK, and taking away Scotland in that. But Japan can kind of be included in those boards. But even then, we want to compete with Suntory about the popularity of our brand. We kind of feel like we could fit into that category when it's coming to make a great highball or just drinking it neat in that sense. And couple of weeks ago, we got some really great news that we were Distillery of the Year from San Francisco Wine and Spirits competition. I hate to talk about awards, I truly do, but the only reason why I talk about it, A, because my team tells me I have to talk about it now, and B, it's a validation for our founder, Dave Vitale, who I mentioned earlier, and then his number one hire back 15 years ago, Sam Slaney, who's our head of operations at our distillery back in Melbourne. It shows them like, hey, they're doing something right. They gambled everything. Like Dave put everything he had financially into this brand, emotionally into this brand. His kids grew up in that distillery over in Melbourne before they moved to the United States a few years ago. It was all like a passion project. It was a financial investment that he took on. And Sam was the first guy that said, yeah, I'll jump on board and go on this ride with you. And he's been with them ever since. So to see those two be able to go to this award show in San Francisco and accept that and just have these giant smiles on on their faces while they're wearing velvet velour suits, matching suits as well, which was fantastic. It was so great for them. Like cheered up that whole entire night. Was bummed I couldn't make it out there, but I had another event going on, I think here in Chicago. But immediately was like called them, text them, emailed them, like all the the heartfelt messages I could possibly conjure up in my head, because it shows like people are recognizing that Starward is a brand to compete in this market. It's good whiskey. It's something different from people to enjoy, but bourbon lovers can like it. Rye drinkers can enjoy it. Obviously, single malt drinkers can enjoy it. Scotch fans are kind of catching on to like, hey, this little distillery out there is doing some interesting things that we do as a brand. Or as a drinker, you can acknowledge where double pot still distillation, all single malt, malting all the barley and everything. But then it's this new technique of putting it in red wine casks. Yeah, we have brands like Avalao or Glenfarclas that have been doing this forever. Glendronach, putting them into 100% red wine casks and letting them mature in there. Sometimes blending them with bourbon barrels to make their whiskeys, but no one's doing red wine maturation we were doing about, I think, 15,000 red wine casks now fully maturing whiskey at our two facilities. So people, I've been out there for 3.5 years peddling this, talking on the old interwebs about it, talking about it in person. Our team has grown. When I first started, it was literally just my boss and I, and we were flying across the country, missing each other in every other city and just promoting the brand as much as we possibly could. And from then we wrote to my counterpart, Katrina, who's our brand ambassador out on the East Coast, who's situated in New York. And now we have 9 to 10 people in our US team 3 years later. So I think the numbers itself just kind of helps people grow the brand, and we're developing and putting a lot of input into our marketing as well when it comes to US press.
Yeah. So there's like 4 different things that I've got to circle back to.
Yeah.
I'm going to start. You mentioned Katrina on the East Coast, and it's sort of funny. There's another podcast, a podcaster that I'm friends with. His name's David Levine, and he has Whiskey in My Wedding Ring. And he and I apparently are running parallel lives right now. We communicate over direct message all the time. I've met him in person a couple times. He actually has her joining him on an episode in a couple of weeks, and it seems like either he has a guest right before I do, or I have one right before he does from the exact same brands, and we're not talking about it at all. So it gives me a little bit of confidence that, I'm seeking out the right people, because he knows what he's doing, and he's got an incredible talent. I'm just sort of here to have fun conversations with people.
Right.
But what was the award that they got from, what was the award you guys just got?
Oh, it's from San Francisco Wine and Spirits competition, World Spirits competition, which is kind of like the granddaddy of them all for that.
Yep.
It's like being inducted into like a Hall of Fame, or the Grammys, if you will, is a kind of a good way to put a parallel line to it. And we won Distillery of the Year, so we were the most awarded distillery, which means a few different things. A, you have to enter that competition. You got to pay for each individual whiskey or spirit to be judged, which there's a flat rate fee for that. But we weren't afraid to put all these things in there and to be judged, if you will, and by a panel of people who consider themselves experts and who we consider experts when it comes to having great palates. And I think we won 12 double golds, which means every judge said this is a gold medal winner, and then 3 other golds with our whiskeys. And some of our core spirits were in there, some of our single barrels won that, and then at the end of the day, we were awarded with the Distillery of the Year.
Yeah, and that's the main reason I wanted to go back to it. Is a few episodes, I don't know, maybe a couple months ago, I talked about the different awards, awards companies that exist, and San Francisco is obviously one of them. And getting a double gold is obviously a huge honor, but to be able to get enough of these awards in one year to be able to be Distillery of the Year, right? Because you said you hate talking about the awards, and maybe you hate talking about a double gold, but there's no reason you should hate talking about distillery of the year, because that's not one that's given to every, like, you can't have 47 distilleries of the year. You have one. You may have 47 double golds, but distillery of the year, that's a thing you can kind of hang your badge on, and realize that you're growing the quality of whatever it is that you guys are putting out. So don't knock on it too hard. But do you think that, because one of the things that I noticed, when we're paying attention during the pandemic, to everyone's online presence and what they're doing, and you guys were there, y'all were mixing it up with just about anyone who would listen, and just trying to find a way to maintain interaction with the consumer. And from listening to your podcast, Key in the Lake, which is fantastic, and anybody should listen to it who's into whiskey, obviously. But you prefer in person, right? You prefer being able to sit down and have these conversations with people. But there was something about your presence, your company's presence in the online forum in a time when we couldn't, that just said, we still want to interact with people. Like, we just want to interact with folks. And I think that may be what's paying dividends, and you're showing this significant growth in the last 6 months to a year. To me, it feels like those things kind of go hand in hand. Just it's part of the ethos of who you guys are.
Yeah, it was also part of a way to keep my job too. My wife works in social media marketing. She used to work for Beam Suntory for about 6 years, and over the pandemic as well. So, we were bouncing ideas with each other right away. And she's like, you might see Beam steal some of my ideas out there, actually. But, we were kind of just going around, if it was the podcast, if it was our brands, because Callum, at the time, worked for Aberlour as their brand ambassador here in Chicago. Wilson at the time was with Union Horse, and now he works for Castle and Key. So is anything about like keeping our brands relevant? And for me, I just wrote up a business plan for my bosses, and been like, we can do a whole virtual experience. It's going to cost money, but hey, we aren't doing in-store tastings. We aren't going to do $2,000, $5,000 whiskey shows across the United States. Let's take that budget and start to adhere it and integrate it into the online space, because people are there. I mean, if you step outside of the whiskey world, people were developing TV shows on Instagram Live. People were developing dating shows on Instagram Live. They were doing Zoom like comedy shows that interesting to watch, I guess, if you're like a delay and all that kind of thing. But for us, I thought about, we can still be relevant in this space. This doesn't mean we have to go away. We can actually probably harness the crowd and garner even a bigger following, because people can still buy whiskey. Liquor stores are still open. There's online delivery platforms. So I just thought, like, why can't we do these virtual tastings all over the place? And we had some local retailers here in Chicago that are willing to ship across state lines, and take the penalty if it might happen. Well, we started working with some DTC websites about making our whiskey available online through our through our website. So I just was like, all right, I'll just go. Like, I had this crowd from the podcast, and I'll just kind of slowly, I guess, convert them into Starward fans, not trying to do it, I guess, like, sneakily or anything like that. But I'm just going to use the platform for both, because what else are we going to do? We're just sitting at home, and we just started doing these virtual tastings. We had the budgets between all three of us, between Callum, Wilson, and I, to do some pretty cool tastings. We were like, hey, let's invite 30 people on. Let's send some samples out, put them in a cool kit, throw some stickers in there, throw some pins in there, jump on Zoom and chat for 2, 3, 4 hours and see where the night takes us. So yeah, it was definitely a direct response to the pandemic. Obviously, so many brands did it. If they weren't doing it, I'm not sure what they were waiting for. I did see some people kind of come onto the game like a year and a half in. I'm like, it's probably a little too late to be launching the virtual tastings and going into.
They're just playing catch up. They're playing catch up.
Yeah. But I just was talking to my friends about what you're going to do, how we're going to do it. And one of the coolest things about it was, as a brand ambassador, but also somebody who runs a whiskey podcast, I could bring my friends along and do it that way. So it wasn't just Aberlour, Union Horse, and Starward. We had other brands like St. George helping with us, with other friends, involving their brands. Sagamore comes to mind right away, and just doing some fun things for people that are out there that are still listening to us.
Yeah. And you said that you were trying to find a way to keep your job, but I've I've been in a position in my past where I'm doing just enough to keep my job versus doing something that I'm passionate about. And I may be way off base, but it came more across the lines of, yeah, you're trying to keep your job, but you're trying to keep your job because you're passionate about the things you're doing. So what you're willing to do and sincerity and genuine nature of what you're doing kind of comes across. It's not like I did see a ton of other brands trying to be in the space, but it very much felt like treading water to me. Like they were just
Mm.
we're marking time until we can be back in person. Whereas it felt like you and the folks that you were working with were really just interested in, yeah, you want to maintain some sort of connection with the consumer, but you still have a degree of passion about what you're doing, wanting to educate people. Even if you can only reach 30 people, it's still 30 people more than you could reach sitting at the house.
Oh yeah. And first of all, thank you. Yeah, I do. Thanks for recognizing that. I mean, I have a passion for whiskey. There's other brands that I've worked for that I don't know I would if I would have followed through the way I did,
Hmm.
as I did with the pandemic over COVID with Starward to promote that. So thanks for recognizing that, because there is a great passion of whiskey, but there's also a passion for our brand. I consider my boss, the founder of Starward, a friend more than an actual employer. When I say like,
Hmm.
hey, I'll bring my boss to an event, or like, hey, this is my boss Dave, is introducing the people. He's like, shut up, like whatever. Just kind of washes it off because he's just a regular dude that happens to own a cool distillery. But
Hmm.
yeah, there's a huge passion for whiskey. It's been a part of my life for a really long time. Been working in this industry now for like 8 straight years or something like that, and there's a lot of love for it. There's also a lot of love for like the online community, because that's how you essentially build your space these days. As if you're recording a podcast, if you're running
Hmm.
an Instagram page, so the two just kind of evenly went together, which is really unique. I think for most people, because I was online way too much probably over the pandemic. You step back a little bit, like, and our parks were closed, our running paths were closed. Like, I feel like our streets were closed half the time. Is like we can't really go do anything outside. And so many Fridays, I remember getting done with work, and my wife would be like, "Oh, it's 3:30 on a Friday. Close the computers." And like, well, there's nothing else to do, so let's go see if anybody's doing Instagram live, or like see if you
Right.
can pop on and get a part of a conversation. But yeah, I think passion definitely drove all that over the last few years. Without a passion, I think for whatever you're doing in life, it's hard to kind of keep going. I've been there where all of a sudden one day I'm just like, I have to quit this job now. And if I don't quit it today, I'm never going to quit it, or I'm not going to be happy. But
Hmm.
also with that was like months of developing a plan to quit and then follow through with something different. I think you should probably have a plan when you're going to actually quit your job, and not just say I'm done, I'm out of here, and
Right.
do the whole half baked exit, if you will.
You
Yeah,
cool. I'm out. Yes.
yeah,
No, I'm
pretty
I'm
much.
I'm on board with that. Yeah, and y- you're not wrong. Like having a good plan to kind of exit out is pretty vital, because
Yeah.
it alleviates a lot of that stress that can come along with being a part of something pretty terrible. And you guys put off a vibe, and maybe I'm wrong here. I work in technology, and specifically in ag technology, working in software, and I work for what could be equivocated as a startup. It's a tech startup and has been that way for a little while. Um, you guys feel very much like a startup, and the fact that you're talking about the founder is more of a friend.
Hmm.
You guys, it's your boss. That relationship, it exists, but you know his name and he knows your name, and he probably knows your favorite color and maybe what your favorite drink is, which doesn't happen in a lot of industries. Do you think that is part of the reason why you're drawn to it? Like, are you drawn to that sort of startup-y bootstraps nature, or it just fit because of the people?
Yeah, definitely. I've only had like one job in my life where it was a corporate job, if you will, and even then I was still a contractor, so I kind of had my own freelancing to it in a way. But
Hmm.
I've worked for art galleries that are just starting. I've worked for numerous whiskey brands that are just starting, breweries and all of that. I love that foundation built on, we have a plan, we have a passion, but we don't know what's going to happen at the end of the day. But we have a why of what built into our brand. Of there is a core focus to it, and Starward definitely fits right in there. It's like when I started, obviously they were approaching 12 years old as a brand, but only been selling whiskey for I think less than 8 years at that point, because we didn't sell anything until a drop was barrel aged for almost 4 years.
Hmm.
And in the US, it only been there for like a month. It barely existed here. And But I met my boss at a whiskey show in March of 2019, and we just kind of hit it off. And an hour later, basically, we were having beers over at Goose Island, and offered me a job. And I actually had a couple other positions I was applying for at the time and interviewing with, and had some offers. But when it came down to thinking about it over the weekend and talking to my wife about it and talking to friends about it, it seemed like the perfect fit because they were doing something truly different, and there was a different atmosphere to it where, like you said, my boss already, like, we already had this like built-in core relationship that felt very familiar, felt very friendly, but also it felt like there would be this professional platform for us to kind of build a better relationship, not just as friends, but kind of as professionals too, in that sense, and go out there and execute this plan he had to bring this Australian whiskey to the rest of the world. And kind of felt right into that. I was like, all right, I'm ready for a new challenge in life, but gotta try the whiskey first a few more times to make sure it's good. Because it was confusing because it's a weird whiskey. I mean, it's a single malt from Australia.
Mhm.
Just think about that in the first place. Then you're putting it into Shiraz barrels, you're putting the Pinot Noir barrels, Cabernet cask, let them barrel age, and then you blend them together. And I'm like, okay, well, this time I had like a honey, ginger, spicy taste to it. So next time I had more of like a strawberry vanilla taste to it. There's always like kind of like core peppery spiciness in there. I'm
Mhm.
like, this is weird. And like I would try it with my friends, like Wilson. I remember we were sitting at Delilah's one night, and I was kind of mingling over him. I'm to hate this job, and I'm like, have you had it yet? He's like, no, let me try it. So got him a pour, but he's like, damn, this is really good. I'm like, okay, so it's not just me. Like, it is good whiskey. It is good
Yeah.
out there. And yeah, and like, I remember talking to my wife, and she's like, this is a no brainer. Like, this is everything it's all about. Like, you want something new, you love new challenges. It's a brand you can truly believe in, and it fits you as your personality, as somebody who's never content and always moving and looking for something better or more to explore. So yeah, kind of a good relationship there. And like, it's cool when your boss and you can go out and to Nashville for a night and have a long, long night, and next morning you're like, fun times. Yep, one in Nashville. You're like, all right, one in Nashville, buddy. And the night ends there, and then you go on, do your sales calls, sell some single barrels, and then go repeat the next night.
So I'm gonna assume you're saying you might have some single barrels sold into the Nashville market. Is that a correct statement?
We do. Yeah, we actually have I want to say about a handful now down there.
Sweet.
Yeah, kind of nothing actually in Nashville. It's all like Franklin,
Okay.
Spring Hill, kind of down in that area. But yeah, a few other ones out there. Some really cool single barrels that are 100% wheat whiskey, which is a little bit off the beaten path what we do. But we do have one wheat whiskey called Twofold, which is a blend of wheat and
Mhm.
malted barley. And this year, or kind of at the end of last year, we started introducing wheat single barrels to the U.S. market. We had 8 of those, and I believe 2 of them are down in Nashville area.
Yeah. The reason I ask is Nashville is the closest metropolitan area to where I live. It's only about a 2-hour drive. So now I'm just kind of knocking on my list here. Like I need to go to Franklin and slash Spring Hill,
Mhm.
pick up some bottles. I've got to go get some other stuff from a local group in Nashville that I want to pick up anyway. So I'm just adding.
Nice.
Well, there goes my paycheck. So that's super fantastic. This
Happens
is
to us
that.
all the time.
Right. Yeah. It's a regular situation. And honestly, that's the main reason that I started the podcast, so I can excuse buying bottles and just having one hand. My wife's like, why do you have these? It's for the podcast. Even this doesn't make any, this is not
It's a
a
beautiful backdrop.
exactly. That's all it's for there. So you mentioned through the course of this last couple minutes, you've worked in art galleries, breweries, distilleries, whiskey brands, like, but you came from Des Moines. You
Mhm.
went to Drake. Like, how do you end up here? How does Jake get to where Jake is today? And go as deep or shallow as you want to on that.
Oh, that's a good question. I really like that question because it is a long, complex answer, I guess, in that sense. And it goes back to what I said at the very beginning of this podcast. From Des Moines, all I ever wanted to do was get out. Didn't never traveled as a kid, but um, traveled through reading novels, reading stories. Some of your favorite authors you'd think of, like a Steinbeck and F. Scott Gerald, all of the great writers of America, that you could find these explorations through their pages and through their words, and I just kind of caught along to that. And got the travel bug early on, and by the time I could start affording to travel a little bit in college, just kind of took off with that. And the day after I graduated college, I went and had a burrito with my best friend, went skateboarding, and then got in my car and drove to New Mexico and worked in an art gallery with a family member who owned an art gallery down there, and just needed some help. And I'd spent my summers down there hanging out, and was like, well, just graduated journalism school in 2009. The housing crash made everything terrible, and all magazines and newspapers are also crashing. So there's not a lot of journalism opportunities out there. So sure, I'll go try to sell some art for like $10,000 to people that don't have money to spend money on, but for art. But it all worked out eventually, and I
Right.
kind of got this job through a family friend as a part-time job doing event planning. Basically, I was like a roadie for events and for a corporate
Okay.
company, and was traveling all over the country. And was one-time gig turned into 5 years of traveling across the country and going to every major market, seeing people from every walk of life you could possibly think of, and having conversation with them, and really just seeing the world. And started to go internationally, traveling through that as you develop points and all that kind of crazy stuff while flying every day of your life, pretty much, it felt like. And
Hmm.
just kind of one thing that sums it up really well at these travels, I was coming back home to Chicago from California, and it was like 20 up by 25, 26 at the time. Didn't really have anything to come back for. The girlfriend I moved to Chicago for broke up with me, and you're like, why am I going back to my 1-bedroom apartment in Chicago and I can just go do whatever I want? And then we're sitting in Salt Lake City in my connection, like, well, I'm just gonna see if there are any flights to Portland. Go to Portland for the weekend, go do some hiking, hang out in like a little, basically oceanside hotel in Newport, Oregon, and just go hiking in every direction each day. So did that and just hung out, and found that'd be a better time than just sitting in your apartment lonely, thinking about those lost thoughts, those girls you could have had at one point in your life. But everything worked out in the long end. With eventually met my wife in Chicago, so it all worked out why I came here. But yeah, it was just something for me. Was I wanted to do something different with my life. I never wanted to sit in this content, sofa chair of life, and basically raise kids at 30 and do all these other things, and kind of explore things for myself. So I just kept going and going, and eventually, all of these travels I was doing for work, I just got really into craft beer and started writing for some craft beer websites and doing photography along the way. I've always been a photographer and graphic designer, and started designing some stuff for some small breweries and doing some photography work. And then in 2015, I was like, this whole whiskey thing seems to be catching on. And not like, I'm not talking about the big brands, the big bourbon brands out there, but it was
Right.
these craft brands. In my area, I'm talking more specifically about Journeyman, Few, Koval. They were like, wow, these guys are like doing something really cool. It's like 2-year-old whiskey that tastes good, actually. And so eventually I went and applied for a job at Koval and worked part-time there for a couple months, and then eventually got onto this full-time gig. And the catalyst behind all of that was really my grandfather. He was an engineer at Jim Beam, and he was there for like 15, 20 years in the late 80s to 2005, and retired in 05. But there's all these stories I kept hearing from him about the people he worked with and these luminaries of the whiskey industry that seemed really important at the time. But when you're a kid, you don't really know. When you're 15, 16, you have no idea still. And then when you get like 21 and 23, 24, 25, you start to understand like the complexity of his job. And I start talking to my uncle, who was also an engineer, and he talks about how like my grandpa transformed his distillery, and still in your early 20s, you don't really understand what that means. But then you start
Mhm.
getting into whiskey, and I started reading about whiskey. History has always been a big passion of mine. So any whiskey book I can get my hands on, I'm reading about it. Next thing you kind of know, I'm turning like 26, 27. I'm really interested in whiskey. And I start putting together the idea that the pieces together that, oh, like he's talking about like Booker. No, he's talking about like Baker Beam and like
Mhm.
all these very important people when it came to the whiskey industry that were his friends, his colleagues, people he worked with on a day-to-day basis. And then you start to kind of understand like, oh, my grandpa like basically helped revolutionize Jim Beam or bring it into a modern company. Like when he first started, they were using ropes still like to measure the mash tanks. Like this is like the
Right.
early 90s. It's crazy. And like that's because nobody was buying bourbon. Nobody was buying
Mhm.
American whiskey at the time. And I all of a sudden you're like, oh, that seems really cool. And so the first time I got to bring him a whiskey that I worked for was a great opportunity, really special moment between him and I. Of course, I brought him our bourbon from Koval, who I worked with, and he's like, well, it's not bourbon. It's not made in Kentucky. It's like, all right. I'm gonna fight the stigma with a guy who actually knows the rules of bourbon. But he
Right.
enjoyed it. Probably enjoyed it more just because he got to see that his grandson was working for a distillery and seemed to have the bug that he had for whiskey. And he had many jobs. He didn't retire until he was like 75, 76 years old. He's 93, 94 now and be working if he could. And he just he always said that Jim Beam was the best days of his life. So kind of where it all comes together with him after me traveling all around the world and traveling around the United States and trying all these great beers, and then trying all these great whiskeys started popping up in like 2014, 2015, just kind of all stuck together and got a job. And here we are now.
It seems like you're riding the wave of it feels like you're right on the front end of understanding like where American consumers are going, because you touched on the craft beer thing, and the craft beer thing kind of ebbed and flowed a little bit. My dad started home brewing 25 or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And when we traveled as a family, it would always be like, oh, like, let's go somewhere where there's a microbrewery, let's go somewhere where there's opportunity to try different things. And this is before I could drink, like he just wanted to go and experience it. And then once I was able to drink, it's like, yeah, we'll go and we'll kind of experience these things. And then there's this sort of tipping point that happens where craft beer is still a big thing. It's not gone anywhere, but there's this new thing that's starting to happen. It's bourbon, right? And bourbon's kind of on this upward trend. And I think that bourbon is headed the same place craft beer is the fact that it's still widely popular, but there's something else on the edge of kind of like stealing a little bit of its thunder. And it feels like, I don't want to say alternative whiskey, that's not the right term, but like craft whiskey / alternative single malts. And so thinking about what you guys do, thinking about what craft distilleries do, people having a more human connection with the thing that they consume, I feel like that's kind of on the upward trend as well. You see all these craft distilleries popping up, and you see single malts popping up from a number of other countries than Scotland or England or Ireland or Japan, right? Or Taiwan, right, for that matter, right? You got those kind of big players that exist, but you start seeing other countries pop up with single malt whiskeys or other types of whiskey. And it feels like we're on the precipice of that. And, your current job is now working in, Australian single malts. It feels like we're on the precipice of kind of just exploding out the category. Instead of building up the main brands, we're going to explode out the rest of them. That's my layman's interpretation of what's going on. You work in the industry every day, so you could be like, nah, that's stupid. You're completely wrong there.
You're right. You're on for sure. I mean, it's interesting now how our lives have been so consumed by social media and by technology that our phones, it can't be more than a foot away from us, or we feel like we're like without a limb.
Right.
Yeah, but this all started, I think, a long time ago. I mean, the iPhone's been out since what, 2007?
Mm-hmm.
People wanted to get back to working with their hands. I mean, Portlandia made millions of dollars on making fun of it every single day, but in every bit of a joke, there's an ounce of truth to it. And there was more than an ounce of truth there, because people wanted to get back to something that they enjoyed, something they had passion for, where they could build it with their hands. And it wasn't about being concentrated behind a computer every day of their lives. And so I saw all these distilleries, know a lot of these owners, know a lot of these distillers, a lot of these makers that were like, I just want to do something different with my life. I didn't want to do what my parents did. Nothing wrong with that. Like, my parents were both educators and teachers, amazing parents that raised me in an awesome family where I had, food on my plate every night. But at the same time, it's like, that's just not for me. Like, maybe I'll take a risk, and maybe I'll go out there and make $30,000 a year, live in a crappy apartment, just escape. But you know what? I go home happy at the end of the night each time. I leave that shift. If you're a distiller and you just worked a 12-hour shift from 12 p.m. to 12 a.m. I know a lot of those guys left with a smile on their face because they could see what they're building. They're a part of something new, a part of something that could develop its own legacy. And so many of these brands talk about that. They see what all of these legacy brands have done since 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, post-prohibition, and developing something to leave behind for their family. It's almost like a love letter that they're leaving behind for the next generation to enjoy. And these craft brands are going right there. In their 2010, 2012, we had a few hundred American whiskeys distilleries. Now we have over 2,000 distilleries. People obviously caught that bug. Is it a trend? Absolutely. Or is there a money grab involved with that? Some people, 100%.
Always, yeah.
But at the same time, there's a lot of passion out there. There's a lot of people that are like, I just want to explore something alternative than what I thought I was supposed to do as an 18-year-old, to go to college, commit to a major, graduate 4 years later with $100,000 plus in debt, and then go off and live your life. And like, how do I enjoy that? Like what is the purpose of that if I don't have any meaning behind it? And so I know a lot of these brands were just like, I don't even know if a whiskey distillery is going to be the thing at the end of the day, but I just want to do something that's going to be built into this community, built in something creative, and have some passion built around it at the end of the day, and like build those kind of three things into the ethos of a company. That's what happened with like Koval. That's what happened with a Journeyman. I mean, I know Bill went to or the owner of Journeyman went to Scotland to basically be a golf pro and learn how to run a golf course and do all that. And he just started drinking with scotch over there and was like, this is interesting. And then he actually went down to Australia and studied with Bill Lark at Lark Distilling, the same distillery where Dave, our founder, learned how to be a distiller. Came back to America, didn't even know what to do, goes to Koval and be like, hey, you guys are starting a distillery. Can I use your still? Before Koval even used their still, Bill ran the very first batch of Chicago that first batch of whiskey in Chicago post Prohibition, legally anyway.
Right.
And it became the Ravenswood Rye, which was like a trademark for them, and then a trademark that was sued by the Ravenswood community. To Journeyman, they don't call it that anymore. But yeah, it's like these guys like, I don't even know what I'm going to do, but I just want to do something different, something that I can make with my hands and show it off to the community.
Yeah, and I mean, you're definitely right there because you can find those stories across, bourbon pretty prolifically. The folks that worked in, Silicon Valley or in, politics even, and they've, finally given up, and they want to go after something they can create with their hands. Even if they're not distilling, they're creating their own blends, their own, they're going out and selecting barrels. There's like this mixture of, alchemy is the best way to describe it because it's like this mixture of science and art that kind of comes together and creates this unique thing. And what you're identifying, I had this conversation, so I'm on the younger end of Generation X, and I was talking to a guy who was on the older end of Generation X, and you're squarely rooted in a millennial / Gen Z type mentality where the boomers, your identity was based off of your ability to provide. Like, you have a job, that's everything you are. And then whenever our generation came around, we were very antithetical to that, but in the sense of, we're just not going to do anything, or we're not going to identify ourselves that way, but we still kind of fall into that trap. But you get into millennials and Generation Z, you're going to try to find something that makes you happy. Like this is just something that you can attach yourselves to, because we boomers were made happy by their job. Generation X was made happy by the money that they made from their job to go do something fun. And millennials and Gen Z look at it like, why can't I do both? Why can't I make money while also being happy? Those two things should merge together. I think that's an appropriate place to be. I think that's a good place to be, specifically in whiskey, because it kind of pays through. And, you mentioned there's money grabs in this craft whiskey game, and absolutely, but people wouldn't be doing it if there wasn't interest here. And there's interest here because consumers are connecting with it, right? So yeah, you're going to have those people, but that's a sign of good things. That's a sign that people are interested in what you've got going on. And so we've gone down a pretty significant rabbit hole here. And so I'm gonna keep. Yeah, I'm here. So you said you didn't travel much as a kid, and you did a lot of traveling through books, right? So you mentioned some authors here, in Steinbeck and Fitzgerald and a host of other people. What's the favorite book? Like, what is the book that Jake has read more than once and might read regularly?
My favorite book of all time is Into the Wild by John Krakauer. Also one of my favorite movies of all time too, which really brought that identity of exploration upon me, if you will. Not that I wanted to define myself as a traveler or explorer, whatever that might be, but it gave me this itch to go find something greater in life than just what's in front of me. So I probably revisit that book every few years. But I also read, I probably read The Great Gatsby every year. I go back and just quick read, it's 160 pages, something like that. Kind of gets you into the mindset of how tragic love can be, and how we can be, if we don't kill our ego and take a step back and redefine ourselves sometimes, then our ego will literally kill us. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned in that. And like John Steinbeck novels, Cormac McCarthy, some of my writing heroes in that sense. But John Krakauer probably, with Into the Wild and every other book he's put out, one of my favorite authors out there. But yeah, Into the Wild is something I'd revisit the movie at least once a year, and go back and just it was a collision of so many favorite things in my life back in 2007 when that movie came out. Eddie Vedder, helped produce it. One of my favorite musicians. Sean Penn, just like all around badass of cinema. It's like cool. He's involved with this and doing it all together. One of my favorite books. And then Emil Hirsch is one of my favorite actors of all time. And when I had shorter hair, we used to get comparisons to each other, even though I think
I can see it. So I was getting ready. Getting ready to make that statement because I can absolutely see the similarities that exist there.
Yeah, I think I'm like a foot taller than him probably, but
yeah, he is a short dude. He's short like me.
I saw him in person one time. He was pretty short. But yeah, we used to have like a wild, crazy hair, kind of like big and curly and fluffy, all that stuff. So yeah, it was just all this collision that came together to kind of create this really great movie. And I know, like reading up on the movie, that John Krakauer and Sean Penn wouldn't do the movie unless they had the family's approval, and Eddie Vedder was involved with decision making too. And I really respected that. Like one of my favorite scenes of that entire movie is when Christopher McCandless's dad is like sitting in the street and pulling his shoes off and crying when he realizes his son has died, and takes him back into this like childhood perspective, not just about his mindset, but the way the camera's angled, and makes him look so small but so big as a human being at the same time, and just lets go of that whole entire guard. And he's crying right in the middle of his suburban home and suburban neighborhood, where like that's what Christopher didn't want in his life. He wanted to shed that as much as possible. But then his father is finally vulnerable enough as an individual just to like let go. And then it's to be a human being, almost like he was being baptized in those tears, and then also in that sunlight too, in that day. Just a powerful movie. If I talk about it too much, I'll probably start tearing up. But yeah, along with that, just one, yeah. So good stuff right there.
Yeah, I think I may have to end there because there's not really a better place. Like you've got all of the quotes, kill the ego before it kills you, and baptized in tears. Like the imagery you just created, I need to be done now. I can't say any more than that. I think did you mention Cormac McCarthy, like the On the Road or The Road?
Yeah.
Okay. That dude's got some really dark writing, like some dark writing.
Man, if you live in the desert for long enough and you get what the desert's all about down there, you can start to relate in some very odd ways. Yeah, living in Santa Fe for about a year and a half, kind of like 2 years cumulatively. You're like, oh, right, I get this weirdness, this stillness, this darkness that's out here. Like when it's dark, you can't see in front of you. Like you can't see your hand in front of your face. There's no lights out there. So it's a strange place. But yeah, The Road is great book, great movie. So many different things he's written over the years. That All the Pretty Horses series is absolutely amazing. But yeah, that guy was kind of one of those lessons that I was a writer in college, and kind of always use those skills somewhat in my professional career, I feel like, ever since then. But I was just reading an article about him one time, and he was so poor. I can't remember which book he was writing at the time, but he was a really young writer, and he was so poor that he waited for to get free toothpaste samples in the mail, and probably couldn't afford his rent, couldn't do anything in life. But he told himself wherever he learned this lesson from was, whatever you start, finish, no matter how bad it is or how poor you might think it is to yourself. If you finish it, at the end of the day, you can be proud that you actually finished it. And that's kind of one of those lessons I took with me from like 21, 22, kind of on in my life. It's like, you know what? I might hate a project I'm working on. I might be literally sweeping up floors and mopping a floor after an hour tour in a distillery and don't want to be here right now, but just do the best of your ability and finish your job. And hopefully that will lead to something better in your life if you want it.
Yeah, you're definitely not wrong there. And it's, not nearly as romantic, but, a handful of years ago, I was working a project in software and I absolutely hated and absolutely wanted to be out of it. But I had that, sort of that dutiful sense of I at least need to finish this before I think about, whatever's next. And someone actually approached me. I was like, "Hey, are you interested in coming working for me, on XYZ," which sounded significantly more interesting than what I was working on at the time. I was like, "God, I really want to go," but I didn't. I was like, "Nope, I need to finish what I'm working on now." And it ended up panning out into the appropriate thing, right? Like I did the yeoman's work and finished the monotonous, terrible, horrible thing that no one should ever have to do, and came out the other end with something that was sort of appropriate. And so, it can often feel a little bit like self-flagellation, but it was the right thing, right? And whether it's some sort of cosmic intervention or statistical probability or whatever thing, things seem to work out in the end. Trying to think of what I want to ask next.
No, that's a good point. I think it's a good prideful and a new like I guess form of art that recently reminded me of that was, have you seen The Bear on Hulu or
Oh my,
FX?
look, man. Okay, so I worked a number of different restaurant jobs in
Yeah.
college, and one of my really good friends is a criminal defense attorney in Northern Kentucky, and he worked at some of the same restaurants that I worked at, and we watched it separately from each other. And he sent me a message the other day that was like, watching this television show has put me in a place where I want to like just lay down my law license and open up some sketchy restaurant somewhere and see what happens. And I'm
Right.
like, man, it's super dangerous because there's a connection to the passion that exists in those type of people that is almost impossible to replicate.
Oh yeah.
And I've told my wife a number of times, like, if I could make the money that I make now working in a restaurant, I would, but I would have to take significant risk to get there as well, because I would have to own the restaurant. I mean, I don't make like crazy money, but where do you live in Western Kentucky in a town with a population of 20,000 and make more than $10 an hour working in a restaurant? You don't, right? So
Right.
you have to own the restaurant to make anything. But yeah, I love that show.
Yeah.
That's just beautiful.
Absolutely, and it's so spot on. I've been able to hang out some pretty cool restaurants in the world and the country. We actually partnered up with Michelin. Starward
Mhm.
did this past year, so got to go to some pretty cool places, and you can meet some pretty intense people and some pretty passionate people at the same time. And yeah, I get like everything that he was trying to shed from his prior experiences of working at the very top restaurants in the world to coming back to this family structure of a restaurant, little hole in the wall, and try to incorporate something new and something more durable for every person that works inside of the restaurant industry, and not just go repeat the old and go into that same formation of like, hey, we're going to yell, we're going to scream, we're going to be almost like militaristic in our style of making food, because probably every person in that kitchen or someone who goes down that line is they enter the food world because they have passion for it, and they just lose
Mhm.
that passion because you get consumed by the culture, and it can be a negative or it can be a positive culture, and he's trying to reinforce the positive. But at the one of the end of those one of the episodes, he was cleaning everything, and he's comes from being a 4-star Michelin, a 3-star Michelin chef, and running the best restaurants in the world. And now he's cleaning this little mom and pop shop in Chicago after like no one respects the tools that he has, the knowledge that he has, what he can bring to it. And he's doing it the most persistently way possible because he still has passion and care for what he does on a day-to-day basis. And it took me back to like literally mopping our distillery floors after a tour. It's 9:30 at night, just worked 8, 9, 10-hour day, still have a 20-minute bike ride home. And you're like, I could leave it for the next person to do it the next morning, but is that fair? Like, do your job, do what you can. If you do love this thing, maybe down the road you'd be doing something better. And that's kind of like I tell myself a lot of times while working for some smaller brands, making less money. And then, eventually you meet this weird Australian dude at a whiskey festival, and you're traveling over to Australia to hang out in a distillery. And next thing you know, you're talking about Australian single malt all across the United States.
Right. Yeah. It's like I said, it's cosmic intervention. It's some statistical improbability. It's whatever. You, you can attribute it to whatever you want to attribute it to, but at some point you have to be receptive to acknowledging the statistics or paying attention to the universe or doing whatever, right? Like somehow you're in tune with whatever kind of put you there. But man, yeah, I'm on the edge of needing to like buy a restaurant now and move into a more passionate line of work. I enjoy what I work on, but man, that's um, it's pretty interesting. But it's not always, I also remember the times where I'm working in a restaurant sort of sucked,
Hmm.
like it can feel like it sucks the life out of you. You have one shitty service and all of a sudden you're ready to, burn the entire place down or
Oh yeah,
whatever. Um, so
been there.
this is a hard transition. I want to talk about episode 179. You know what
Okay.
episode 179 is of your podcast, Key in the Lake?
I don't. Remind
Okay.
me.
So it's the one where you talked about anxiety, right?
Oh,
So
cool.
I think it is in as much as or as little as you want to. But I sent this to you and I've said this to a number of other people. Um, it was to me and considering what's happened in the last couple of years, episode 179 from Key in the Lake podcast was probably the most important whiskey podcast that you could listen to this year, without a doubt. Without a doubt, just based off of the content, the rawness, the openness, or whatever. But you were in a place. You were in a place, and then you talked about it. And so, share what you want about it, or don't share anything you want about it. Just kind of you've got the stage here.
No, I appreciate that, and thank you. That's really kind words right there. Yeah, it's weird. I've never been a person who had anxiety. I'll be 36 years old in 2 days, and never really had anything I consider heightened anxiety at all. And some of those like little moments where like, hey, I'm about to like quit my job, or like I just lost my job. Like, what am I gonna do? Like normal moments where people have anxiety built into their mind and the stress that's on them right there. Cause you're not just dealing with like for me, for example, it's like not just me, it's my wife that you have to factor in too. But yeah, all of a sudden, like I said, I've been someone who's traveled a lot. I've flown over 1,000,000 miles, fortunately, in my life, and seen really cool parts of the world, and talked to various people and really amazing conversations and amazing outlets and cool restaurants, cool bars, cool beaches, all that kind of stuff, and never took it for granted at all. But all of a sudden, one day, almost a year exactly from now, I was sitting on a flight going back home from a work trip in Seattle to flying into Indianapolis to my in-laws, and was flying over the mountains connecting through Salt Lake City. And next thing I knew, like I thought I was gonna have a heart attack. I didn't know what was going on. I'm looking out the window. I can't feel myself essentially, if that makes any sense to people who've ever had an anxiety attack. And but what I was doing, what I was experiencing was a panic attack in mid-flight. I didn't know it, calm myself down somehow, eventually to like get on another flight, which didn't happen on the connecting flight, weirdly enough. But then it started to ramp up every time I traveled. And by the time the year ended in 2021, my mind, my body would be crippled with anxiety days leading up to flying, and even the day like after flying. By the time I got home from the airport, and the podcast I said, I would lay on the couch and just feel like I'd feel safe because I'm at home, I'm on the ground, but I couldn't move, and I was so like just succumb to all the anxiety, all the pressure that it took over my body, that I didn't want to do anything else. It made me reevaluate a lot of different things in my life. I'm somebody who totally supports therapy. In my early 20s, started going to therapy, absolutely saved my life. Just through the stresses I was going through in that time. Don't have to get into that, but I've always told people like go to therapy. I've told people who are 65 years old, like you've never been to therapy, go to therapy, like try it out. Like don't knock it until you absolutely go and try it and help yourself. Like you help your body, help your mind as much as possible. And there's a stigma of therapy, of having depression, of having anything psychologically wrong with you. As we were growing up, as our parents were growing up, obviously, and one of the beautiful things about the internet, there's a lot of negative, there's a lot of positive that's helped spread or just help shed the stigma of therapy being a bad thing or being a faux pas. People are openly talking about it, how it helps their life, how it saved their life. And I just wanted to kind of contribute to that conversation, because I've known people who have killed themselves because anxiety, because of panic, people who didn't know what to do other than take their own life into effect. I'm not somebody who worships celebrities, but God, when Anthony Bourdain died, that hit me. I mean, right now I'm thinking about it. Like I know exactly where I was. I was walking through Cobalt Distillery at 8:30 in the morning, taking photos that I always do on a Friday morning. And one of the distillers came up to me and said, "Did you hear about Anthony Bourdain?" I was like, "What?" And I just knew like it was not good.
Mm-hmm.
Like why would I hear about Anthony Bourdain on a Friday morning? And I sat down on a case of bourbon and just sat there for like 20 minutes. And that's somebody who didn't reach out to anybody. He was going through a lot of shit and didn't reach out. So what I've always wanted to do is like help spread the word of like reach out. And that's why I wrote a post about it on Key in the Lake about his death. Later on, I think a year anniversary, or the year, I guess the year anniversary, whatever you want to call it, of his death, about like, hey, reach out. Like I'm somebody to talk to. I'm somebody to go on a walk with, somebody to go on a run with. And I thought I could control my anxiety. I could control the depression I was experiencing last year just through working out. Cause I've always said that's one of my major medicines in life is working out. I run 5 miles in the morning, no matter how freaking cold it is here in Chicago. It's pretty stupid most times, but when it's like -2 and all of a sudden you can't feel anything below your waist, and you're like, oh, really should have maybe just stayed inside and rode the bike today, rode the little Peloton thing. But on a more serious note, no, I became wrecked through anxiety over this last year, and it was through flying. I didn't really get it through anything else. And I started experiencing it through driving in like an Uber or driving with somebody who I didn't know very well or whatever it might be, but it was totally just overtaking my life. And um, I really think talking about it on that podcast and just saying it out loud to people really helped it. It's been tempered now. I've done a lot of steps to take to make sure that the anxiety has been lowered. I'm not somebody who's a big fan of medication. I just like want to do things
Mhm.
naturally. I don't want to be stuck on that. And there's a lot of addiction that happens in the alcohol industry. Obviously, people always kind of worry about that. I'm always checking myself, like, all right, did I drink too much this week? Did I drink too much last night? And then how do I counter that? How do I always make a game plan up to try to stay healthy when you're out consuming a lot of extra calories through alcohol? And, maybe that helped. Maybe that kind of created some of my anxiety because I've been out for so many years doing this job and drinking late and, doing whatever. That's not necessarily healthy for your body. Eating burritos at 2 a.m. isn't always healthy, surprisingly enough. But yeah, no, thanks for like bringing it up because it's something I've thought about a lot. Few people have reached out here and there and said thanks or like, shared their story. And I'm like, you know what, guys, like that's the amazing part of this, that we can all share each other's stories. We don't have to feel guilty about it. We don't have to hide it anymore. It's anxiety, depression, therapy. It's not a stigma. It's a part of
Mhm.
reality. And, you see it so unfortunately, you see it right now with veterans and how many veterans are taking their life on a daily basis. And you just think like, if those guys can be the ones out there, these heroes, these patriots that can be like, hey, like let's like get rid of this. Like let's talk about our problems. Let's talk about how therapy can help. Let's talk about the issues we're having internally with ourselves and collectively as a country, as a group of humans, as a human race in general. Like maybe we'll be better in helping ourselves and helping the whole community out there. So just mostly was a part to reach out and let people know like it's okay to feel some hurt. It's okay not to be okay, essentially.
Yeah, and I mean, uh, you're a little closer to my age than I thought you were. You said 36, 37.
Yeah.
And you grew up in a city, but in a city that is in the middle of the, I don't know, Midwest. It is a different vein of people, and I don't know if this is how you may have grown up different than this, but in my particular area, there's this unhealthy degree of stoicism that exists
Mm,
where you just sort of you don't you don't talk about negative emotions on a regular basis aside from maybe with your spouse or your immediate parent, right? It's
right.
not a global conversation to be had, and it's not necessarily a matter of shame or anything. It's just this is my business, it's not your business, and we shouldn't be talking about it. And that's one of the worst things that can happen in anxiety, in any sort of mental health situation. Is isolation is
Mm,
almost death. And you know, I've listened to I'm a subscriber. I listened to all your podcast episodes, and there was nothing in any of the previous episodes that could have indicated it. Just as an avid listener, right? That's not
right.
something that you can pick up because we're well versed in hiding how we feel and not having that conversation and not being as raw and real because it's vulnerable because um, a host of other reasons. And so it was, more importantly, I heard that and I was like, my first reaction was like, I want to have him come on just so we can talk about that particular thing. Like, I love Starward. I love what you guys are doing, but I was like, this is bold and raw, and this is a conversation that needs to be had in more places.
Mhm.
We've grown up in a time frame where we have seen way too many once in a lifetime events, right? Whether it's 9/11 or the LA riots or Rodney King or, you know, uh, COVID or insurrection or what, like we've seen too many things that people should only have to see, like, oh, this is my once in a lifetime event. You talk to older generations, like, I remember where I was when JFK was shot, or I remember where I was when the Vietnam War started. I have like 25 of those things.
Mhm.
And that all creates this like emotional baggage that can feed into anxiety or feed into depression or feed into any other number of unhealthy mental welfare states. And we just aren't supposed to talk about it, especially as men and
Right.
things. And we don't talk about those things. And it was incredibly refreshing. I don't know how hard that was for you. Maybe it was easy. And if it was easy, I applaud you because that's not for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, I think there's a few things there. Like one of my favorite books slash movies too, Fight Club. There's a line that says we're a generation without a great war,
Yeah.
and it's like, yeah, we aren't, and neither was that generation, I guess, either. But we're a generation of many small tragedies that have developed into these catastrophic events that have wrecked our entire society, not just in America but globally, and that impact's huge. Like I remember Columbine, like we didn't know what was going on, and that was the beginning of something now that we've gone down this horrific rabbit hole of replication of something that
Mhm.
happened now 23 years ago. I remember sitting in my 8th grade math class when that all happened, and we didn't know what to do. Like my dad's a high school principal. He was running the high school across the street, but I mean, he's a very fair individual. And people are like, yeah, you know, all the weirdos that wear trench coats, like they can't come to school the next day. And it's like, well, what? Let's hold off there. Like these are people that just express themselves through clothing, as so does the cheerleader who wears
Right.
Abercrombie and Fitch. And but there were so many emotions going on, no one knew how to react. Now look, 23 years later, we're still having those conversations. There's no resolution to it at all.
Mhm.
And you know, we can't resolve these bigger issues at hand. Like I'm not trying to make it political at all, but like I grew up in Iowa. I grew up going hunting. I grew up with a hunting family. I'm pro Second Amendment. I'm not pro AR-15 for any somebody's down the street that has like some sort of background that it could be of a criminal background or whatever it might
Mhm.
be. But at the same time, like, yeah, you should be able to have a gun in your household. You should be able to have a shotgun to go hunting. Cool, great. But we can't put we have so many guns. We have more guns than human beings in America. We can't put that genie back in the box in the bottle. You know, like we have to figure it out, but we haven't figured it out. We can't figure out these giant societal issues because there's always an argument from one side, argument from the other side, and we can never meet in the middle because there's a political agenda to have. But I think one thing we can think about is like the mental health of an individual,
Mhm.
mental health of society. Like everyone's like, hey, let's make better people. Let's make winners in this country to make sure that our country is the best country, that we put it out for the world to be portrayed as. And we can only do that through conversation. Like it's been a huge learning experience for me over the last decade or so about mental health, physical health, everything that comes about being a good human being for like for your own self, but also for the people around you. And the one thing we can only control is that small space, our small environment in this world. But from what I've learned from many people is that when you affect small change in your environment, you can affect bigger change out to the world. And if I can, like, you know, if one person can reach out to me like, hey man, like I have stress too. I have I think I should get therapy, or I think I should do this and that. And I can say, yeah, man, like it worked for me. Here's some outlets you can go to help
Mhm.
yourself, to aid yourself. Then, hey, there we go. Like that's all I can do. Like I just want to make sure that people are good, because one thing that I started to really realize through this anxiety and just watching people in airports and things like that, like there's a lot of people that have anxiety while flying. I never realized it. I was somebody that got on the plane first, got my
Mhm.
bag situated, earbuds in, whatever it might be. Like, why is it taking so long for everybody to board? Like, I can't just get on the plane. It's so easy. Just get your bag, get on the plane.
Right.
And you didn't have, I think I'm an empathetic person, but I didn't have a lot of empathy for people when it came to traveling because I was in the
No.
airport so much. And you're like, just get from A to B and to C as fast as possible. But now it's really changed. Now I'm like, I take your time. We're all gonna get there. Eventually, this plane's gonna land from Denver to Chicago. Like somehow, some way, we're gonna get there. And I think a lot of people just need more empathy for one another. I mean, that's the thing that would help the world out a lot more. So that's all that I was trying to do with that podcast. And I don't know if it was hard or easy to record it. I always wonder when I'm talking. People listen to our podcast. I don't talk a lot. I just kind of ask questions, set up situations, and let the guest roll, because I want that conversation or that episode to be about the individual who came on as a guest. So when I do, I think I've opened up 4 times on like solo podcasts, And I'm always like, does anybody care? Like what I say by myself? I don't know. Like, I think I'd rather hear somebody else telling their story versus mine.
I feel that thoroughly. I do my dead level best whenever I try to have somebody join me on a podcast. Is number one, I try to listen to any other interview they've ever done, and just avoid those questions because I
Mhm.
want to have a real conversation. Not that I don't want to give you easy questions that you already have tons of answers to, but I want to talk about just like I want to get to know who Jake is, or who Chris is, or who Alan is. You know, any of these folks that have joined me.
Yeah.
Um, and realistically, why would anybody care what I have to say specifically? Um, but it's one of the best things that I think that came out of the pandemic, right? So we've got this time frame where we all lost a year and a half,
Mhm.
um, and then some, depending upon what industry you work in or however.
Yeah.
But the prolific utilization of telehealth that exists now, right? So living in a rural area, when it comes to mental health, number one, is there a stigma if you happen to go into the storefront? So we've got a place here in our town, and you go into the storefront, but right down from it is a restaurant where
Mm.
your friends and family may go in. If you're seen going in, is that going to be a barrier to entry for you seeking out some sort of care or mental health that exists? But a number of places are now offering the ability for you to sit at home and make that phone call and have that conversation, and even do it face to face, whether it be through a Zoom call or some other sort of teleconferencing, where it's not just a faceless phone call. And I love that that exists now, just because it gives people in rural areas access to a wide array of healthcare options. Because the other side is, I can go to our local place and maybe it sucks. Maybe
Yeah.
the people there, and I'm going to say something that may be offensive to some people. I really don't care, but they may be there under the guise of having a license by saying, I am a licensed Christian counselor. And see, the problem with that is that I can go onto a website right now and I can take a quiz and become a licensed Christian counselor.
Oh.
But that's enough to stand up a storefront in a lot of places
Hmm.
and be a counselor for people for mental health issues. But
Hmm.
because I have that religious connotation and I live in Kentucky, people are like, oh, I should trust them. You absolutely shouldn't. Like, you should do some research on who it is. But if that's all that's available to me, then I'm probably going to get shitty mental health care.
Yeah.
And that's almost worse than none. Well, it can be very much worse than none whatsoever. Um, but,
That's a
but
great point. No, I actually had to switch therapists because the dude was like putting too many thoughts in my head. Like, I'm like, "Dude, you're stressing me out. What you're making me think of things and situations that I never even could conjure up on a plane," you know? And I was talking to I guess he'd be like a life coach slash like, physical therapist type of like, I don't know, something like awesome kind of dude who
Mhm.
lifts weights and gives you a workout program, but also kind of like guides you through life. And this guy was in Houston. I met at a believe it or not at some bars and doing some events, and we're talking like he's this big jacked yoked dude and with like a soft soul and like a great outlook on life and is super intellectual. And we're talking, and he's like, "You just got a bad therapist." Like, you just need
Right.
somebody else. And I'm like, ding ding dong, like right there, light switch goes off in your head. And you're like, yeah, definitely. Like therapy can be good. Like it can like build some good principles, but if it's built around something like religion where there's an ulterior motive to why you're doing that, I've been in that situation too. Like even with a family member who was like,
Mhm.
kind of wanted to have that. I was going through stuff in my early 20s, like is all based around God. I'm like, well, I don't think God's the answer right now. It's probably more something to do about like why I want to take a gun and put it in my mouth and pull the trigger. Like that probably it's a
Right.
bigger issue right there than the actual God. But like, but I appreciate the help they wanted to provide, but just had the wrong way of going about it.
Yeah, but and that's the wrong way can be bad, and the thing is, it may not even be that the counselor is bad at their job. It can be a bad fit, right? Because
Yeah.
you have to have, at least in my limited experience and understanding, you have to have someone that you feel like you can trust and that you think is legitimate, and that person just may not fit you. It
Yep.
could be their background, it could be the way they talk, it could be any number of things that happen in just normal interpersonal communication that kind of throws them off for you. And so having choice available to you is a big deal, like
Right.
having access to um someone that can listen. Like, it was huge, and listening to that, you know my immediate thought process is like one of the other podcasts that I listen. This is my podcast listening is real weird. I'm just going to say that right
Same.
now. So I've got a podcast that I listen to that's called Hood Politics, and it's this guy on the West Coast that basically just relates what's happening in the current North American political climate to how politics in the hood work, like in Compton specifically, like how gang relations work. And it's like a super interesting take on it. And then one of the other ones is Mayim Bialik, Blossom / Amy from, she's got a podcast, and it's a mental health podcast. It's all it is. And it's fantastic. It's like an hour's worth of whatever. And then there's, anyways, so I end up, listening to this, and I hear you talking about it. I'm like, this is a place where these things kind of intersect. And I think these are important conversations. You just don't hear it. Like, the whiskey space gets real broed out real quick, right?
Yeah.
Like we're just whiskey, and sometimes there's not a lot of genuine relation of human beings that occurs,
No, you're 100% right on that. I think we forget, or we suppress so many feelings because there's alcohol there and every night. I'm talking more like from a person who's out and about, hanging out in bars and restaurants and retail shops on a daily basis. Is you have another drink, might forget about your problems, and then you wake up the next day and the problems are still there, but for a few hours the night before they were gone. It's a lot. There's a lot of problems in the whiskey industry, a lot of problems in the spirits industry. And one of those main things is mental and physical health, and the way you kind of beat your body up, but don't actually take care of yourself that way. Seeing a lot of people kind of go down some weird paths, some unhealthy paths, if you will. In a lot of times they can correct it, but sometimes you're kind of past the point of no return, or past the point of, oh man, this is gonna take a lot of work and a lot of effort to get back to somewhere more ground level.
Yeah, and that's, a lot of times it's just getting started. Like that's the first step.
Yeah.
You said you had that mantra of finish the job. Like you need to finish the thing that you're doing. The other side of that can be just get started on doing whatever it is. Is it mental health? Is it physical health? Is it, whatever, right? Kind of exploring anything. So you have a podcast. That's where we were talking about it.
Allegedly.
And so there's a guy that's in the chat here. His name is Robbie Deadlow, and he is a part of another whiskey podcast called Chill Filtered. And I've actually teased them before. They're maybe the second best whiskey podcast without whiskey in the name of it.
There you go.
And I kind of made that statement, but I don't know that they don't listen to your podcast, so they didn't know that it's my own inside joke to myself that I told them at one point in time. But you don't explicitly talk about Starward. Actually, you don't talk about Starward a ton at all on it. You talk about a ton of other brands. Does Starward get bothered by that, or is that just part of the deal? It's like, this is who I am.
Interesting question. They're totally cool with it. There's actually a long running joke that my boss has never been on it. But that we've literally, I bring them wherever I travel for work. I bring 2 microphones with me and a recorder, Zoom recorder. Like, just never know if something's going to happen, pop up, go into like a hotel room, record a conversation, all that fun stuff. But, I don't know how many times him and I have tried to set up a podcast, and the one day we actually had it set up was March. I must have been like March 18th, 2020. There was a big whiskey festival happening in Chicago. So we used to record our podcast in a place called Beguile Brewing, which is an awesome brewery here in Chicago. If you're ever in Chicago, go buy their beer. Great people, great beer. But we did the first year plus recording our podcast in their brewery. And this Friday before this big whiskey festival, we are going to do these like 3 podcasts in a row. And the last one was going to be like live with like friends. Like, we're just going to go all out and hang out. Lou Bryson was going to come in. My boss was going to come in, do episodes. And then we were just going to do like a big industry podcast. But then COVID happened, never happened. And ever since we've been teasing about it, like, oh, we're going to come on. And now it's just a big inside joke that my boss has never been on the podcast. And our whole marketing team is in on it too. So fun times there. But no, they're totally cool with it. But another company I was interviewing with the same time I was interviewing Starward, they were like, you got to shut it down. And I was only like 20 episodes in maybe. But they were just like, they're like, you're just promoting other brands. I'm like, yeah, it's a whiskey podcast. Like, I didn't work for you when I started this podcast.
Right.
My whole idea was about telling the stories behind the bottle. I want to hear about distillers, ambassadors, bartenders, owners,
Mhm.
whoever it might be, share their story about the whiskey industry, the spirits industry. So, but they're like, yeah, I don't think we can do that. And then I'm like, okay, like, kind of considering it in my head. And then the next conversation was about, would you like to sell vodka? And I'm like, what? And they're like, because it was with a portfolio, it was part of a distributor.
Right,
And
right.
my job I was applying for was to be a Scotch market manager. But they're like, you could do this job in your sleep. If I could tell you could do it, blah, blah, blah. But like, would you ever sell vodka and beer? I'm like, I'm here to sell whiskey. Like, what? And I was like, I basically like just kind of like ended the interview and I was like, you know,
If I sell vodka and beer, does that mean I get to keep the podcast but only talk about whiskey
yeah,
again?
right.
Because
I was
I'm
like,
yeah.
yeah, they're like, "Yeah, you'll be in this, like, for a year, and then we'll move on to the next thing." I'm like, "That's not really why I wanna do this," but, no, Starward's been great with it. They're really cool about it. When I was over in Australia for the first time a few years ago, like, somehow it came up in the office. I was working in the office one day and be like, "You have a podcast?" And, like, "Has Dave been on?" And I'm like, "No, Dave hasn't been on yet, but, we'll get him on." And they're like, "Oh, we'll listen to it." So it's fun. It's a great time. I've had one of my Katrina's been on once, which actually she was just on like 2 months ago for the first time. But we're going to do we're going to Tails next week, our whole team, so we're going to do a big team Starward podcast. But they're great about it. They don't push me about it at all. They know like I'm a whiskey lover, and
Mhm.
it, we were talking about earlier, the two worlds did collide a little bit there over COVID as we were doing like virtual tastings to the podcast. But we just saw that like as a really great way to do free virtual tastings for people out there, and also support our brands at the same times and just talk about whiskey with people like-minded people.
Yeah, and it seems like at least with smaller brands, there's a more openness to this. There's a seat for everyone at the table.
Yeah.
There's the rising tide lifts all ships. Like that's a thing. And cooperating with other brands can put you in a position where you may end up in front of a consumer that wouldn't show up. They didn't show up for you. They didn't show up for Starward. They showed up for Abalor,
Mhm.
but you're there as well. And so now you're gaining access to it. And it feels like, at least, that smaller brands are more open to that because they realize that there are many, many ways to a consumer, and this is one of them we can get there. Because
Yeah.
I 2 years ago, I did not know who Starward was. And if I'd have been one of those people that shows up at a local liquor retailer and they're like, "Hey, we're doing a Starward tasting," but like, I don't know what that is, and I would probably kind of keep going.
Right.
Say, "Hey, we're doing a tasting of whiskeys, and here's the 5 brands." I don't have to know any of them, but I'm like, this is an opportunity to taste 5 different brands at one time and kind of see what's going on. And so, it gives
Yeah.
you an opportunity to kind of broaden your reach a little bit. Who's been your favorite guest that you've had on any episode, or do you have one? I mean, is this like asking
Uh
for your favorite child?
no. I mean, like, most of our guests are really cool. I kind of really handpick our guests. There's only been one person that came on that I didn't know very well, and I didn't feel like it went very well either. It wasn't like the person was a jerk or anything. I just was like, I
Right.
didn't have a connection with them. One of the other guys booked everything, so it's not necessarily a sense of that, but um, one that stands out and one that like let us know that we were doing something correct and the validation, as we were talking about before with the distillery of the year stuff, was when Graham Cruikshank, the Abelauer master distiller, came on. And this is before I even knew Callum. Callum's predecessor was Alan Clark, who was the first Chicago Abelauer brand ambassador. Him and I had built a friendship through the industry, and their PR company like reached out to me like, "Hey, would you want to have Graham Cruikshank on? He's coming to America, and he's our master distiller." Blah blah blah. And I'm like, "Yeah, I think so. That'd be cool." So I actually had just gotten back from Australia like the day before, and we recorded another podcast before we went to go record with Graham. So like I was like kind of like out of it. I'm like, well, okay, cool. We're going downtown to the Hoxton to record a podcast in a swanky hotel with some guy I know about but don't know at all.
Mhm.
But it's always good to jump kind of outside of your comfort zone and do those things. And this is the first like legit master distiller we are having on the podcast. And then it was like an amazing hour conversation, and we hit it off right away. We've become friends since then. He's I think he's been to my apartment. When he comes to Chicago, he comes on the podcast. We go out drinking. We're at an event together right before COVID. It's a big Avalar event, and Callum kind of grabbed me. He's like, "Hey, like, can we get out of here? Like, let's get Graham out of here," and like pulled him away. Went to like a dive bar in my neighborhood and hung out for the night. So I would say Graham's been probably the coolest guest we've had on, where like, okay, just let us know we're doing something correct when it comes to doing this podcast.
And it feels weird. Be like, there's no one in my family that knows that I have a podcast.
Mhm.
Obviously, some folks in your family know that you have a podcast because someone with the exact same last name as you followed me this afternoon after you
Oh, yeah?
shared some stuff. Yeah, I don't even remember. It's a
It was my
woman's
wife.
name. I don't
It can only
think
be my
so.
dad. It has to be my dad.
Julianne Hookie.
That's my
Hookie,
mom.
Hucky. Is it Hucky?
Hookie.
What? Hucky.
Hookie like cookie.
Yeah, so your mom followed me on
Mom.
Instagram
All
today.
right,
I feel
Julie.
really really privileged to be able to have a mom follow, but like it feels weird to tell people like, oh, I have a podcast,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
just sort of saying it out loud.
It's embarrassing.
Has there been? Do you have an episode where you're like, man, I just wish I had never recorded that? Have you had one of those yet?
I don't think so. We've lost a couple episodes just through bad recording. There's no one I regret having on at all, because like I said, I have an idea. Most people, PR agencies do reach out to us and ask us to have them on. I'll be like, and I'll start telling them like that's not really like what we do here.
Mhm.
And then they'll ask like if anybody asks me for a list of questions, I'm like, oh, sorry, I don't think this is gonna work. I'm like, you haven't listened to like ours is a very free flowing conversation, just like here. We can talk about like Jason Bateman movie for 10 minutes and then like have
Right.
a serious conversation about the history of bourbon. Like it's just gonna go all over the place.
It goes where
So
it goes.
yeah,
It's like a
exactly.
river, man. It just goes where it goes.
Yeah, and like I don't know, I've kind of like I would say I forced a couple in there. We do this thing called the 12 days of barrel picks over
Yep.
Christmas, where we do release 12 episodes in 12 days about an individual single barrel. And like some of them were kind of like reaching, not the guess, but just like, like do we really need to record that? But it's kind of fun to just do that project and send in that sense. But and even then we were kind of doing one with Traverse City, and it kind of blew up the old message boards of the whiskey industry on Facebook and Reddit, because they have like a problematic single barrel about where their MGP whiskey is being distilled. Is it being distilled in California or in Indiana or in Kentucky? Because MGP actually uses Bardstown sometimes as a contractor, which people don't know, but it's still MGP whiskey, but just distilled in Kentucky, blah, blah, blah. All those nuances there. So that was kind of fun to like, the brand was like, can you pull the podcast? I'm like, dude, you don't want me to pull the podcast. If I pull it down, it's only going to create more controversy that way. And my wife, like I said, works in social media marketing in the whiskey industry. Is like, no, like you shouldn't pull it down at all. You guys didn't do anything wrong. I'm like, yeah, it's going to blow over in like 2 days. And it did, because it's just a whiskey podcast out there on the internet. It's not like Ben Affleck and what's her face getting married again. So yeah.
Did Ben Affleck get married again?
Yeah, it's Jennifer Lopez. Round 2, baby.
Maybe we're gonna get Geely Part 2 then.
Oh God, I can only hope. But didn't she die?
And I mean, does it really matter?
It's
Like the
true, but
7 people who watch that will be worried about the continuity of it, but
it's like
no
any
one
Marvel
else saw the
movie.
movie.
You never really die in Marvel movies anymore, or Star Wars movies for that point. So
No, I mean, look, I'm pretty sure that Iron Man's dead. You can't bring him back.
they had a funeral.
Yeah, there's a legitimate funeral that happened, and I'm really glad that they killed Captain America. But that's neither here nor there. He's the worst character.
I gave up after Endgame. I'm like, I'm done. I'm not watching any more of these. I'm like, I can't do it anymore. Can't dedicate my life to this. So
it was worth it. But yeah, no. Yes, I mean, Captain America was supposed to die long. I'm gonna go comic book nerd, and I'm gonna stop.
No, let's do it.
Captain America should have died during the Civil War. That's when he was supposed to die. That's when he died in the comic books. He's the worst. He's just this cut rate version of Superman. And I don't even really like Superman either. It's not a great character. Give me a Batman all day long. Give me an Iron Man. Somebody who's a hero but also a little bit dark, a little bit grimy. Like that's fantastic. If I want a pure comic book character, maybe I want Spider-Man because he's a child. Just a child is what he is.
Good point.
So, so Chicago, you mentioned that you're taking Graham to a dive bar in your neighborhood. I'm not going to ask that one,
Yeah.
but I find myself in Chicago a couple times a year for work. What's a dive bar I should be in?
Dive bar you should be in. Well, I don't know if it's necessarily a dive bar. It's built like a dive bar, but it happens to have like the greatest whiskey selection in the country, and that bar is Delilah's. They
Okay.
have they are a they will say they are a punk rock bar based around DJ spinning every night. Does that happen? Yes. Is that how it was built? 100%. 29 years later, it's known as the best whiskey bar in Chicago and one of the best whiskey bars in the entire world. They
Yep.
have over 2,000 whiskeys. They have a Starward single barrel. I don't know how that happened. And amazing collection of wines as well. If you ask about the wine selection, they will tell you about it. But if you don't see it, it's because it's hidden. But they will present it to you if you ask about it. Great beer list there, full of like local beers and beers all across the country and world too. So it's just become this like epicenter for great drinking, and you can drink from any part of the world. Inside this little great Lincoln Park neighborhood bar called Delilah's in Chicago. I believe they won best whiskey bar in the world in 2020, I think. Yeah, but it's like a dive bar essentially. Upstairs, there's one pool table, a Star Wars pinball machine, and a bar with amazing whiskeys.
I can't play pool for shit, so that doesn't matter to me in the slightest. But somebody else might.
Right.
Yeah, usually we're right in the primary downtown area. We stay at the Palmer usually.
Okay.
When we're down there.
Not necessarily dive bar. Well, you go to Richards. Richards is kind of like the most notorious dive bar in Chicago. Not necessarily legal, but they allow smoking to still take place. They still sell cigarettes. Top bar, so it's known as that. You pay $4 for a domestic beer and have a cigarette, laugh along, sing some songs, and next thing you know, it's touching hands and Neil Diamond's on the soundtrack, and the night's over.
Are there people in Chicago that don't work in the food industry that still smoke? I feel like that's not a thing.
I guess all those cool kids using those jewels out there.
And maybe I'm just because I am turning into a curmudgeon old man, but if I'm going to go to the length of trying to get lung cancer, I'm going to do it with a good old fashioned cigarette. That's what you got to get to.
I agree. I put my American Spirits down about 8 years ago, so I'm not too sure what's happening in the whole smoking scene in Chicago. It's very not prevalent, I'll put it that way.
Yeah, no, I quit smoking a long time ago as well. But John Prine's got a song, and one of the lines on one of the songs is, "When I get to heaven, I'm going to smoke a cigarette that's 9 miles long," and he's not wrong.
No,
he's not wrong. It'll be delicious,
dude. I still have like these phantom senses of like on my hands. Sometimes I'll like my hands will smell like cigarettes, and I'm like, oh god, just one, just need one. I have a jacket I've never washed since I quit smoking, and I'm still can smell it in my left pocket where I kept my cigarettes. I'm like, oh yeah, there it is.
Yep. You catch yourself. So, living in rural Western Kentucky, there's still a good degree of smoking that happens. You might catch yourself going into a restaurant, coming out of a restaurant. We're not allowing it in the restaurants, but there's still people outside smoking. You might just give it a little extra pause to catch a whiff of the guy who's like 2 doors down, smoking a cigarette or whatever.
Yeah. I hear. I see. Like I think Dejar and Blacks, which were clove cigarettes, probably ruined my palate for the rest of my life because whenever I taste bourbon, I'm like, oh, clove. Like I every single time.
It's always there. It's always there.
Any bourbon I drink, it's like, oh, there's a tiny sense of like red licorice with some black licorice with like a little bit of cardamom. Oh, clove? Is that what you're trying to say, Jake? Yeah. So
yeah, no, that's effectively what's happening there. And maybe that's what happened to whiskey there in the mid 90s and early 2000s, because that's what they were like. Clove cigarettes were really popular then. And so maybe just like bourbon just sort of tasted like clove cigarettes, and people were like, I already got that in my cigarette. I don't need this in any other form or fashion.
That's why Jameson took off then, because it tastes nothing like clove.
Right. Well, I mean, it doesn't have a super strong taste of anything, right? That sounds really shitty. That's not what I'm trying to get after. I'm not
big
being
Black
insulting.
Barrel fan here. I'm a big Jameson Black Barrel fan, actually. So
And I think so. Kind of going back to Starward, you were
Yeah.
talking about being a single malt here, and one of the things, at least in my very limited experience, I grew up in Kentucky, so bourbon is king. That's the thing. Screw Jack Daniels, even though it's bourbon. But we drink bourbon here, and Scotch is not got a significant following, at least in my area. Trying to find reasonable Scotch, but Scotch historically for me has been more nuanced in its flavor, and we're still in that single malt category with a lot of Scotches, but it's nuanced in flavor because of the climate, because of the barrels, because of whatever else, right? But what I find attractive with Starward specifically is, and I think that I know the answer to this, but it has some of the same nuance that single malts will have, but it's got just a shit ton more character to it.
Mm.
There's a lot more body and robustness, and I think that it has that because it's in a hotter climate. It's picking up the aging at a different rate. It's not, I hate the term, fast aging or slow
Mm.
aging or whatever. It's just different aging, right?
Yeah.
Because of the climate, because of where it is, it's going to age significantly different. And if you go much more than probably 6 years without doing some sort of a slow water reduction, you're going to end up with something that looks like motor oil,
Mm.
just because of barrel loss or whatever. But you're able to pick up more character while still being in that Scotch realm that is appealing to me, to the cask strength bourbon drinker.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you hit it on the head right there. It's all about letting the region speak for itself inside the whiskey bottle. We where one of the foundations that Star Wars was built on is that we think whiskey should taste like where it's from.
Mm-hmm.
And a big part of that is the climate in Australia. The average temperatures in the high 70s in Melbourne on a daily basis, where like you compare it to Scotland, the average temperature is like 41 degrees. Like there's a reason why there's 8, 10, 12, 23, 25, 31-year-old Scotch, because they
Mm-hmm.
can. You can't do that in Kentucky. Like we've all had 20, I'm sure you've had a 20-year-old bottle of Kentucky bourbon, and you're like, "Oh, that's what I waited for all these years. That's what I paid all this money for." And you're like, "Cool." The experience is there, I guess. You'll always have that to hold on to. But like I one of my favorite stories that my grandpa ever shared with me is when Baker was developing Baker's, he was gonna barrel age it for 6 years. That was the foundation of his just of his whiskey. And my grandpa asked Baker, he's like, "Well, how'd you just settle on 6 years?" And he's like, that's the best amount of time to barrel age your whiskey for in Kentucky." And he's like, "Okay, cool." And then, years pass and he comes out with the whiskey and it's 7 years old. And he asked Baker again, like, "Why is this whiskey 7 years old? I thought 6 was the best." And he's like, "Well, if 6 is the best, 1 year has to be even better." It's like, okay, sure, why not? But it's also like that's a good amount of time to barrel age whiskey in Kentucky. And in Australia, we're barrel aging for 3 to 5 years because we're pulling so much flavor from those barrels in a short amount of time, as we're what we call 4 seasons in a day, where there's so much of the heat opening up the barrels of those pores when it's hot, and then
Mm-hmm.
contracting as it gets colder throughout each and every day. Will drop from like 110 to 60 degrees in like a couple of hours during the summertime. Like that's a high rate of speed of contraction. I've worked for distilleries. I've talked to a lot of distillers that they have 10-gallon, 15-gallon, 30-gallon barrels, and you truly are shocking the flavor into the whiskey. We're using 59-gallon casks, so a little bit larger than the standard size cask here in America, but at the same time, like we're letting that whiskey concentrate itself inside the staves, pull out those wine flavors from the staves that were previously holding Cabernets, Shirazes, Pinot Noirs, Sherrys from all across Australia. And inside of those staves, that wine is almost acting as a filter. We don't really rechar most of our barrels. We only rechar about 25% of our casks. So if we don't rechar the barrels, there's a plethora of wine flavors still inside of those staves. Probably on average, we have a gallon to a gallon and a half of wine still left in the barrel when we start to interact the whiskey into the barrels itself, because we're taking barrels that have only been dumped of wine within 48 hours. We're getting whiskey to the inside of there. So it's a pretty quick turnaround from wine being inside the barrel to whiskey being inside the barrel and barrel aging. And it's inside of those barrels for 3 to 5 years. You're letting that flavor develop. It's not about doing a finish where you're putting the whiskey inside of a wine cask for 3 to 6 months and almost like shocking the flavor once again, because when you put that whiskey inside of a wine barrel for 3 to 6 months, you're only really going through one season of heat probably, and you're pulling out a lot of flavor at one time, but it doesn't allow for it to go back into the barrel and kind of recollect itself and then come back out and find a balance. You just get a lot of like more punchy fruitier flavors right away into your whiskey. And that can hide some imperfections in whiskey. That can make a whiskey that doesn't have a lot of sweetness to it, have some sweetness, have some more character to it. But ours is all about finding this roundabout character between making a really good whiskey that comes off the still and having like this banana, almost like Hefeweizen flavors to our new make, and then putting it into a barrel and adding the sweet characteristic over time, but finding the oak balance in there, finding the right amount of spiciness. Clove is one thing I get a lot in our whiskeys, especially in our single malts. And we're making a whiskey that can be for the masses in that sense, because there's enough flavor of a bourbon drinker can find familiar to it that like a 25-year-old professional single malt drinker can also go enjoy inside our whiskey too. So it's all about finding that balance at the end of the day, but it also comes down to how does your climate, how does your terroir, how does that place speak to you when making whiskey? And for us, it's about making sure we're really using the climate as best as we can.
I like that Hefeweizen note, and because when I think beer, it's either Hefeweizen or give me something that's thick and black, like truck stop coffee. Give me a stout, give me a porter, give me something along that lines. But if I'm on the light end, that's where I want to be, and so that kind of filters in. And that's you touched on something that we sort of get obsessed with in Kentucky, in thinking that it's the hot summers that make our bourbon what it is, and it's not really that. It's a heat exchange game is what it really is. And so what you're experiencing in 4 years is significantly different, because when we get to the summertime, we get to this time of the year, our heat exchange is only going to be 10 or 15 degrees, right? Whenever we're talking about Fahrenheit specifically, we're going to drop down to 80 at night and go back up to 95 in the day, and 80 at night, 95 in the day. When you're looking at a 20 or 25 point differential, you're getting that aging in a single heat cycle. That's what it's really kind of about. And that's and then also, from what I understand, Australia is pretty low humidity whenever it comes to temperature, and that has some degree of an impact as well.
Yeah, there's humidity there, like in the summertime, because we're pretty close to the water. We're only about a
Okay.
mile from the ocean, because we're in Port Melbourne, which is about a mile and a half south of downtown. So we're pretty situated right there on the water. So we do have like this summertime, there's like this weird infusion of humidity just from being close to the water and having that hotter heat. And you have the Indian Ocean waves or air like pushing over the entire country. That's really creates the outback. Then you have Antarctica pushing up these cold temperatures right underneath you, and then Melbourne's kind of like meets right in the middle of it all. So it's like this really perfect spot to barrel age whiskey. It works out. It's like when we really break down what whiskey is, like it's a simple science.
It's a great place to barrel age whiskey or get killed by some type of animal, because like every animal in Australia wants to kill you, right?
Everyone says that, and you're like, you go to Australia and like they aren't like bothered by anything. It feels like I saw some kangaroos jumping through a field one time. That's about the coolest thing I saw when I was over there. But I am going back in September, so we'll make sure to go find some more interesting critters.
Yeah, don't get killed by something. Like, obviously that's not what you're after. You're not trying to find.
Hope not.
What is it, like 11 of the 14 most poisonous snakes are there or something, and then there's the box jellyfish, and there's one of my coworkers, whenever she did her study abroad in agriculture, that's where she went. She went to Australia. She got nothing but great things to say. It's one of those places that when my progeny finally leave the nest, maybe me and my wife will go there, because I don't know if they're worth that level of spending yet or not. We're still they're young enough.
It's pricey.
Maybe they are, maybe they won't be, maybe they'll figure out a way on their own, but it's obviously something that we want to do. So kind of rolling back into the United States here, what is, you work in this industry, what is the best or most interesting trend that is occurring in whiskey in the United States?
I don't know if it's the best, but it seems to be most prolific is barrel finishes. As a brand that does unique barrel aging where we don't finish, we do some LTOs, limited time offerings that have some finishes in them. But our whole foundation is whatever we make, we're barrel aging in red wine barrels. That's just what's going to happen. From day one, it's been that way. And I'm sure it'll continue that way for many, many years down the line. But I also wonder why people are doing these finishes, why distilleries are taking it upon themselves to go buy these barrels from maybe a local vineyard or maybe from a vineyard across the world, because is there a purpose built behind what you're doing? I think a lot of what we've been talking about tonight is like, what's the purpose behind what you're doing in life? And that goes right into this trend of barrel finishing. Are you putting your whiskey inside of a port cask because your whiskey doesn't have a lot of flavor to it and you can put some flavor in there in a few months? Are you taking a stout cask because you saw another distillery do it and it worked out for them and you think, might as well try it and see how it works out for us because we have a brewery around us? Or then you take, for example, which is my favorite American whiskey example, is Westward, a distillery out of Portland, Oregon, where everything they do is the same thing that we do as a distillery. It's about purpose. It's about defining where you're from and showing that off inside of a whiskey bottle. So there's some great vineyards out in Oregon, and they're taking local uh, wine barrels and putting their whiskeys and doing finishes in them to represent Oregon, the terroir of Oregon inside that bottle. They're using local stout casks because Portland has one of the best beer scenes in the whole goddamn world. And they're like, well, why don't we implement what Oregon is known for and what we want to be known for, American single malts, but using something that can kind of enhance our whiskey. And there's other distillers out there like, let's just try it. Let's just see what happens. And is there anything wrong with that? No. But are we oversaturating the market, oversaturating the shelves with something that's just a trend, something that we're just doing what the bottle next to us is doing, or are we doing it to define purpose for ourselves? And I don't like when whiskey is just out there to try new things to see if it sticks, because I've worked for brands like that where you kind of get stuck in this rabbit hole of, hey, we're like the unique, cool distillery that tries new things. You're like, okay, but what are you as a distillery at the end of the day? Like, are you a liqueur distillery? Are you a vodka distillery? Are you a gin distillery? A whiskey distillery? Are you like there's nothing here that's built on a foundation other than trying new things. And at the end of the day, is there consistency to your products? And if there's not, then are people going to go buy that second bottle of whiskey after trying it the first time?
Yeah, and I like that. Are you trying to hide the sins of bad distillate? Are you trying to chase money? Are you truly trying to experiment because you tried a particular spirit or wine or beer, and you're like, I wonder what whiskey would taste like in this, because I can appreciate that. I've had that thought in my brain before as well, where I drink something, I'm like, I wonder what whiskey finished in this would taste like, but I don't have a distillery. If I did,
right,
I'd have one, but then I would also sort of not have it as necessarily a good identity. But if you start with good distillate that's been aged appropriately, maybe you're in the right place. And I really like that you mentioned Westwood, because I will say, when it comes to American single malts, their Pinot Noir,
dang,
it's sitting right over here.
I just had it in a cocktail last night.
It's delicious. It really is. And I'm a sucker for stout finishes. So Bellmead in Nashville, which is the Greenbrier, Nestle's Greenbrier distillery, they've got the Black Bell, which they partner with a local brewery to make theirs. And so I'm on board. Let's give this a shot. What are you trying to do? They were buying good whiskey from MGP. They're like, hey, we've got some people we can partner with locally. You kind of keep their identity the same. And maybe you've already touched on this by answering the question of what is the best trend in whiskey with some also nefarious intent. But what's the worst thing that's happening in whiskey in the United States right now? Is it also barrel finishing?
No, I mean, I think, like, I don't know if there's a worse thing. I think there's like a saturation. I think there's not a saturation of whiskeys, I should say, but I have this conversation a lot with friends. This bubble is going to burst. Like, every bubble always does. It's gonna burst. There's gonna be the ones to stick around because they make really good product and people keep buying it. And there's gonna be like a weird Jameson probably somewhere around the way where they had great marketing and connect into this generation, and it connects to the next generation, and somehow they get lucky and pull it off and start selling the whiskey through generations. That's awesome. But at the same time, like, we can't all last. It's impossible. Like, there's way too many brands out there. You look at how many brands are in the bourbon section or in the rye section, this growing world whiskey section category as well. Like, it's impossible. It's simply impossible for every state out there to be making whiskey and every one of those brands to stick around for the long run. I just hope that people that want to stick around for the right reasons have a chance to pull out through all of this and be a part of a building legacy of American whiskey. Because I think we are living through history right now. I think we're defining something when it comes to American single malts. I think we're doing something amazing when it comes to these next level of craft distilleries that are growing up, They've gone into this 4-year mark. They're hitting bottle and bond status now. They're doing great things when it comes to maturation by letting their whiskey develop and find its flavor, find its tasting notes that can be consistent throughout batch to batch. And those are the ones that are starting to stick around. I think it's amazing. I think the worst trend is people just trying to. If there's one worst trend, it's people that are in it for the buck and they're trying to make the fast sell. They aren't the Pinhooks of the world. They aren't the Starwards of the world that are out there with this like passionate claim to whiskey, to distilling, to blending, to being craftsmen on a day-to-day basis and being a part of their job and part of their livelihood.
Yep. So aside from Starward, because we've talked about Starward, everybody should be buying a bottle if you could find one locally. If you can't find one locally, reach out. We'll see if we can figure out a way to find a spot for you. I can't tell if it's my feed over here or my feed over here, but I think we're losing some granularity. I may have to re-upload this later on. It doesn't matter. What is a brand or a bottle that folks are sleeping on right now that they shouldn't be? Like, what's the thing? And if you don't feel comfortable saying it online, maybe we can take it offline and I'll know I need to pick one up, but I want to be on the cutting edge. I want to be on the Jake's cutting edge of what should be happening in whiskey.
I feel like, so we have this joke on our podcast that we have to contractually obligated to say Pinhook on every single podcast, because since the first time we tried them on a podcast with Chris, actually, we talked about them essentially every single time. And become friends as well. Sean Joseph was like right up there with one of those favorite episodes of mine, where he came into my basement and my wife's like, the founder of Pinhook is coming into our basement to record a podcast in like an hour. I'm like, yeah, last minute, but we'll figure this out. Well, I'll vacuum real quick. I feel like people know about them. I would say,
yeah, it's like right there. There's 2 bottles of Pinhook right there.
I can kind of see I have terrible eyes.
Well, it's intentionally not visible because I'm in that quantity over quality concept. Not necessarily to say that these are not quality, but I don't. You probably get this question too, like, what's your favorite whiskey? I'm like, I don't know, because I haven't tried them all yet. I can't tell you what my favorite is. I haven't gotten there, but I'm trying to get there, and I'm not going to have, 10 $400 bottles, but I'm going to have $140 bottles.
Yeah, right. Same.
But anyway, sorry, you're talking about Pinhook. You think Pinhook's the thing?
Oh, it might be. I feel like it's getting out there. I'll give a shout out to one of my favorite people in the entire whiskey world, and he's a good friend. A distillery doesn't have a ton of national distribution, but they will, because their founder is the greatest psychopath in the entire world of the whiskey industry, and I mean that endearingly. There's this little brand up in Whiskey City, USA, Wisconsin, also known as Cambridge, Wisconsin, called the Dancing Goat. Their founder, Nick Brady Moss, is a good friend who actually we developed a friendship through the podcast initially, and then became in real life friends too. But he is somebody who is very dedicated to building a distillery from literally every screw, every bolt that goes into that distillery. He has his hands on, with a vision that's all his, about how to source whiskey, how to distill whiskey, how to blend whiskey, how to do a Solera style system of blending your whiskey, how to create single barrels, how to take the appropriate scientific approach to making whiskey, because he actually knows science, unlike people that just kind of go out and build a distillery and see what happens. His technique is, I wouldn't say flawless, but it's so detail oriented that it's always built around purpose. Getting back to that. He's only 34 years old, if that, but he's the most knowledgeable person I know about the whiskey industry. It's literally flowing through his veins with his grandfather and his father's legacy in this industry. And he wants to build something great. His goal is for Dancing Goat to become like the MGP of the future, to be a Beam. He replicated Beam's rickhouses and built one of his own on his farm. Is absolute crazy dude, but in all the best ways. So Dancing Goat, if you can get out there and go score a bottle of their rye, score one of their single barrel picks, you will be in good hands. And their whiskey sells between like $45 to $60, nothing crazy.
Yep. So I was actually able to, the World Whiskey Day, they were one of the bottles in that, and I tasted some through that, and I've listened to him on probably half a dozen other podcasts, and man, that dude's entertaining, just
Yeah.
period. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter. And you can tell, it's, I liken him. He's similar to Alan Bishop,
Mhm.
from French Lick, and the fact that there's an intellect there, but there's a passion that exists for what they're
Oh,
doing,
yeah.
and you never know what is going to be said. You never know. I've seen some video episodes that he's done where he'll just disappear off screen and come back with something like, "Hey, I've got this thing. I want to talk about this thing that I just, we just made or picked up or did whatever with."
Yep.
There's a distinct passion that exists in anything he does. So I think that's a good call out as well as a fantastic one.
Appreciate it.
I've got one last question, and then I don't have anything else unless you've got something you want to talk about. And I think we'll at least creep past Chris Blattner
We have
in our link to the episode. We made it there. We didn't even force it. We didn't even just be like, all right, let's just stare at each other for 10 minutes to try to get there.
I just realized we're 2 hours in. I didn't realize it. So
Yeah, an hour and 55. I've been watching the top left corner here. So you're gaining notoriety, and Australian Single Malt, I think, as a segment is gaining notoriety. And you mentioned this earlier in the fact that you feel like you're even competing or trying to be in competition with the Japanese markets, right? The beams that exist, the Beam Suntory situation. But and I think you are. I think you're in that realm of competition. But does that scare you? I mean, does that make you feel like they're going to start showing up and saying, "All right, let's start buying folks up. Let's just start buying brands." So we, because that's sort of what big players do. Is they're like,
Yeah.
"All right, well, there's an interesting market segment that's gaining traction, and instead of starting from scratch, we can just go buy Starward or we can go buy anybody else, and maybe that's not a problem for your boss, but like, does that concern you? Do you think that's like a good thing, or you're not worried about it at all because doesn't matter?
Yeah, well, there's a precedent set in the 1800s. The Whiskey Trust did this, where they started buying up brands, not even to necessarily have them in operation to use their juice, but just to shut them down,
Mm-hmm.
to basically create a devoiding competition. So it's been happening, all throughout ever since the legitimate whiskey industry. I'm sure it happened in Ireland, Scotland, and times before they moved over here and started creating American whiskey. Uh, in full transparency, Starward does have a very large investor behind them.
Okay.
We're not a Diageo brand, but we are a part of a company called Distilled Ventures that is a subsidiary of Diageo, and they invested into us with really the hope of the one day Starward would become a Diageo brand.
Okay.
We're still in this incubator system, so we don't have to really have to deal with like another large global world single malt coming and buying us up and then just feeding us into a blend of something else, where we're actually a part of this development where they want us to become the biggest brand in world whiskey as well, and it has that similar shared focus and that similar shared goal when building the brands. It's not about building the brands and then just like throwing it into a Scotch blend, even though we can't do that obviously, which
Mm-hmm.
I think we're the only Australian single malt they have investment behind. So it wasn't like we could just like start buying other distilleries, throw us into a bunch of blends, and then lose the distillery. And next thing you know, Star becomes a footnote, and people are like, oh, 100 years from now, like Star Wars revived, like the old family recipe, and
Right.
all this confusion to like, what? You guys been around for 150 years, but I just heard about you on Thursday. um,
Mm-hmm.
but I do worry about what my place will be as an individual Star Wars, like legitimacy of my position comes behind when it comes behind selling a world single malt. Like, I'm a guy from America. People kind of give me a little bit of a hard time of like, why are you wasting your time over there? Come over back to bourbon, come back to rye, and like where you belong. It almost feels like an imposter syndrome sometimes when I've only been to a distillery one time, or 1 week, and I've been there numerous times in that week, but I haven't even seen our updated version of our distillery. We renovated 2 years ago, and we have more tanks for the first process of building whiskey. We have a whole different still. We have a whole different setup. We moved 6,000 barrels to a whole different warehouse. And sometimes I wonder, like, am I truly representing this brand in the right fashion, not being Australian? Because so many people meet me. I'm at a booth that says Australian whiskey behind me. And then I open up my mouth, this Midwestern accent, and they're like, what? Like, are you from Australia? And I'm like, no, I'm from here. And
Yes.
they're
Yes,
like,
I am.
yeah.
This is what we all
like,
sound like.
Can you fake an accent for us? I'm like, I don't want to offend anybody I work with or Crocodile Dundee.
It's like Crocodile Dundee lied to you all. This is exactly what Australia sounds like.
Yeah, but so I do. There's a worry that single malts might not make it. I guess in a way, I think there's too many good brands out there, but you could be dominated by some of those other brands too. I think we're doing something special. I really do. Like, I'm not just saying it because I work for the brand. We just released this new whiskey called Octave, which is our first single estate whiskey where we took wine barrels from only one certain vineyard and one type of their wine barrel and barrel aged it for like kind of like a small batch release, essentially what we call it here in America. And the other day I was just, showing it to one of my buyers, and he's like, Starward's grown up. Like, this bottle defines it as growing up. It's like over the last 3 years of drinking it, I've enjoyed it, but this one's like, wow, it kind of blows me away. And like, I need this on my back shelf versus, yeah, I'll take it. I was like, wow, that's really great. It's like, it shows the brand is doing something correct and going in a different path, and people are seeing it now. For its own. It's not just like, oh yeah, that weird Australian whiskey that the guy comes in and talks about every once in a while. It's like, no, you can call for Starward. People can call for Starward in bars. Bartenders know about it when I go and say, hey, can I get like a Starward and soda? They're not looking at me like, what did you say? They're like, oh, I know where the bottle is. And then go reach for it. So there's some validation there, but I mostly just worry about if I'm doing my job correctly and doing the job justice when it comes to being American selling, but more representing a brand from Australia, because you can sell anything. I work with salespeople all the time. They don't have a passion for it. They don't have an investment into the brands. They have an investment in themselves to get their bonus. And that's fine. That's cool. That's why they do that job. I always tell people I could never be a distributor rep selling whiskey for less than $200,000, which is completely outrageous. So that will never happen because I would never want to do it. I like working for one brand. I like working for one distillery. And like like we said earlier, being friends with my boss and being able to like go out with pride each and every day to represent his brand and not just like some random person out there.
Yeah, and you made this statement way earlier, that you're the type of person who's never content, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to shine through. Like, maybe you're right. Anybody can probably go and sell Jim Beam. Anybody can go and sell any of the Buffalo Trace products. Like, why don't you come back to sell bourbon and rye? That's the easy game in North America. At least it feels like that would be the easy game in North America for a salesperson right now. Is we're in the middle of a bourbon boom. Come back and sell bourbon. That's easy. But your attachment to what you're selling feels like it's just a part of who you are, part of your identity. You're not necessarily content with saying, okay, well, I'm in enough places where I'm recognized. No, that's how do we get to the next step? How do we get to the next level? How do we get to the next place? And it's not because you want to make more money. It's because you want to show people the thing that your company is making. There's a degree of pride that exists within it. And those are the types of things that I think about whenever I start thinking about, larger investors or, corporate oversight. But we're seeing more and more brands where people are investing significant sums, but then saying, I'm not going to mess with how you guys do business. I just recognize this is a profitable venture. And if I give you more money, I think you can make more money, and I'm not going to get in the way of it, and that's, as of right now, that's sort of what, for all the good and bad of it that might be, that feels like what the Pritzkers are doing with Bardstown Bourbon Company and Green River, where they've, kind of got this significant investment. There's a host of other smaller brands that are picking up these types of investors that are saying, just keep doing your thing. But at some point, does the bean counter come in and say, well, if we change our mash bill to this, we can save 2.7% per bottle, and that'll be, but you've got to get to a volume before those types of conversations really come into play. But so I think I've wandered around that.
No, I think it's so true as well, because I was just down in Kentucky. My wife and I were down there doing the Bourbon Trail and hanging out in Louisville for a long weekend. And there's a reason why we brought back the bottles we brought back from the distilleries we purchased bottles from. And there's other distilleries we went, did our tour, and as soon as the last sip of the tasting was done, we got up from our chairs, kindly excused ourselves, and walked out the gift shop empty-handed. And it wasn't just because the whiskey wasn't our favorite. It was because of the experience we had there or didn't
Mhm.
have there. And you could tell like, oh, like we're just trying to mass produce these brands out here because we're trying to make some money. And like it looks pretty. It's it's fine whiskey, but there's nothing special about it. But when I can go into Peerless and have like a 7-year-old single barrel that tastes more unique than any bourbon I've had in a very long time, sure, it's worth the money to spend on that and bring it home. Like I know what these dudes have been doing. Like they revived the old brand. They're transparent what they're doing. They're not saying like we've been
Mhm.
around for 150 years. Like no, we've been back for 7.5 years. We got our number back in Kentucky as a distillery, and we're reviving this brand that our family left behind. Cool. I'm gonna go support you guys. I'm gonna bring a bottle back from Kentucky because I understand that. I also grabbed a bottle of Green River by the way. So yeah.
That was one of my most pleasant surprises because Green River, the distillery for Green River, is only a couple hours from my house. You know,
Yeah.
it's relatively close. And you know, before when it was OZ top, we won't. Anyways, that
Yeah.
was a really really big surprise. And then in 2021, you know, I kind of ran through, you know, what are the favorite things that I tasted in 2021. Peerless's double oaked came out of nowhere for me. Like I knew
Mhm.
they were doing it, but I didn't know what my expectation was because you know, I did the same thing that all the whiskey geeks in Kentucky did, is I followed Peerless from the day that they started. And whenever they got to their first release of, was it the first release of rye 2 years in, or maybe it was the first release of
Yeah.
bourbon 4 years in?
Is right. Yeah.
Um, uh, they were doing an event. It was like, you know, go line up at the distillery, and I'm toying with, do I drive 3.5 hours to go get a bottle? Like I really want to go, but I couldn't take off. Like I couldn't go up the night before and stay in a hotel, and so 3.5 hour drive plus it's across the time zone, so we'll enter into Eastern time, and so now it's 4.5 technically.
Right.
If I'd have left here at a reasonable hour, I wouldn't have been able to buy a bottle because they were all gone
Right.
within a couple of hours of opening the front doors, because there was that degree of attachment to that particular brand, their story, and what they were doing. And they didn't, you know, MGP exists for a lot of people to be able to pick up and sell whiskey while they're waiting for their own stuff to
Mhm.
age. And there's not necessarily any shame in that, especially whenever you're clear about what you're doing.
Right.
But they didn't take that route. You know, they just sat on it and they ate it for a couple of years, basically trying to get to a rye. And then when they got to a rye, you know, like, what if it wasn't good? Like, what if you get to 2 years and it's like, this is not good? Like, what do you do then? You know, like there's this audacious nature, this unreasonable expectation of success that exists between some of these people that start off
Right.
brands. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Like, there's no reasonable thought that like, this should work perfectly fine, because
Right.
tons of people have tried it and failed. But you did, and then you succeeded, and it came out well. And then when your bourbon hit, it was good as well, right? It's one that
Yeah.
I will always have. Like, I don't have duplicates of anything, but there are some things that when it's gone, I won't replace. And then there are other things that there will always be a bottle. And Peerless lives in that realm for me, always, just based off of who they are, their identity, their ethos, and the quality. You can't get there with one or the other,
Right.
but if both are in place, heck yeah. And you're right. Like, they've got some of the most interesting single barrels that exist.
Oh, dude, all over the place, and it's great. No, it reminds me of when you say like, if it's good at the end of the day, like, is it going to be good? There's this movie called Fanboys. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
Mm-mm.
It's these guys. The whole premise is these guys are trying to sneak into Skywalker Ranch to watch Phantom Menace before it comes out because one of their friends has cancer, and like trying to get there, and like all these crazy little things happen along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Fun little comedy, and so eventually they get into, spoiler alert, they get into just, I don't know, break into a movie theater, blah blah blah. George Lucas catches them, and it's like, oh, your friend has cancer, cool, you can watch the movie. So they get to watch Phantom Menace before it comes out, before anybody comes out. And the very last line of the movie is they're sitting in this private screening of Phantom Menace. Guy turns over to his buds and goes, "What if it sucks?"
Right. Yeah. Like
And
that's the
fade to black,
fear.
fade to black. Yeah, and like we definitely lived with that. Like my boss was making whiskey, Australian single malt, putting it in red wine barrels and fully maturing it in these red wine barrels, and didn't know what the hell was going to happen. 18
Mhm.
months in, he like tasted the whiskey. He's like, it's pretty good. And Jim McEwen came by the distillery by chance. He was visiting Australia to do some work with another distillery, and he's like, "Would you taste it?" And he's like, He's like, I think it's kind of flipped in about 20 months into barrel aging. And he's like, it's fine. Like, it's good. There's a lot of good things going on here. Whiskey takes time. It takes development inside of those barrels. And the worst part of this job is the patience that comes along with it. It's built into what you do because you put whiskey inside of a barrel and wait to see what happens. And you have no freaking control over that whatsoever. And so my boss waited, and he waited for another year and a half and then put out this product. And 15 years later, we're sitting there talking about how we're releasing new products to the United States. We've sold like 60 single barrels across the United States, and people are starting to understand what Starward is as a brand. Like, you just have to take a giant leap of faith, but also know, like, you know what you're doing. Like, starting a distillery from scratch is just to start a distillery, but you don't know how to actually turn the machines on. It's dumb. Like, my boss went and learned from Bill Lark, who's the OG of craft distilling in Australia. He learned from him for a year and a half to 2 years about how to distill after being a brewer himself. So he honed in those techniques and those talents and went back to Melbourne and started his own brand. And Starward is here today because of that.
Yep. And I'll say, so, for a long time, people will be like, what's the most interesting? And interesting isn't as always the best term maybe to use, but what's the most interesting whiskey you've ever tried? For a long time, it was the Bardstown Bourbon Company did an orange curacao finish. I think it was Distillery. I can't remember who it was they did it with, but it was very interesting. Not in a bad way. It was good. And that was my go-to answer until about 9 months ago. One of the tastings that you hosted, I was able to try y'all's ginger beer cask finish Starward. And it was on a tasting where there weren't enough for everybody to get one. And so it was like, some people got this and some people got that. And I was one of the few people that got the ginger beer. That was one of the most fantastically interesting things I've ever tried. And that is the story that I will now tell people, like, hey, what's the most interesting whiskey you've ever had? Like, let me tell you about this time that I had this ginger beer finished Australian single malt. And almost unequivocally, everyone will always say, I understood every word you just said, but I don't feel like any of them should go together in a sentence.
I don't, 100%. Like, I don't even know if the story I'm telling him, like, after getting through all of that, because it's so many levels of story, how this thing took place, like, yeah, that's the right way. And then here it is. Like, drink it, decide for yourself. Because it's first off, it's coming out in America in this fall. So
I saw that.
Awesome.
I think I saw that. Did I see some advertising material on this, or did I make that up in my brain?
No, it's probably out there somewhere in the world.
Okay.
Definitely.
I felt like I saw it and I was like, oh my goodness. But also, I live in Western Kentucky, so.
Well, it'll be available online. So that's mostly where it's going to live. We might even do a fun NFT with it. Getting all crazy out there. But no, it is this weird whiskey. It's the first time I tried it, I don't think I knew it existed when I went to Australia. And that's the first place I tried it. And I was like, I tried a lot of things that day because I was getting very acclimated to the brand. And I had it and I was like, well, that just stands out more than anything I ever tried before. But like, even as my boss is telling me the story of how they built this, I'm like, I don't understand it. It probably took me like 10 times to hear the story about how it actually took place and developed. And it's this weird thing of they had we have a bar at our distillery, and my boss was like sick of buying ginger beer. So he asked the distillers to brew a ginger beer. So being the degenerate brewers they're distillers, they like made a 20% ginger beer or something ridiculous like that.
Right.
And I'm sure it tasted fine, but my boss was like, we can't sell this to the public and put it in cocktails. So they're like, let's barrel age it. So they put it in like an X barrel. I'm sure it was an X Nova barrel, and let it barrel age in there. Then I don't know what they actually did with the whiskey or the ginger beer at the end of the day. They just took it home and drank it for themselves, or I think they gave it to friends mostly. But this brewery called Boat Rocker found out about it, and they're like, "Oh, whatever happened to that barrel you guys did with it?" And they're like, "It's somewhere over here. Do you want it?" And they're like, "Yeah." So they took it back to their brewery. They barrel aged the brew in there for somewhere around like 8 months. I don't remember what it even was. Sent the barrel back to us, and we finished some of our single malt inside of there, and that became the first iteration of ginger beer cask because it had this really like fiery gingery character to it. So then that was 10 years ago, maybe 11 years ago, and ever since then we've been basically doing a release once a year, and the 8th iteration of it will come out this or next January or something like that. But now it's essentially we have Solera, which is our single malt that we always barrel age inside of these Australian sherry casks. They're always recharred barrels, barrel aged for 4 years. After some barrel aging, it's dumped in this giant vat of every previous matured barrel age Solera that we've done over the last 11 and a half to 12 years. And so it mingles together at cask strength. We bottle it at 86 proof. So bringing it down a little bit after that. And so you can technically find like every iteration of Solera inside of every bottle of it, micro doses of it. But what we do is we take that whiskey, and then we finish it inside these ginger beer casks that now Boat Rocker barrel ages their ginger beer they make on site with one of our X barrels, send it back to us. We take Solera out of the vat, finish it in there for like 30 months, and have this like really great, fiery, gingery, delicious single malt that's swarmed with like fall autumnal flavors to it, but then like bright and fresh at the same time and gingery. So it's kind of amazing. Like you gotta try a little sample of it. I don't even have anything of it. I wish I had something of it, but I tell people about it and they're like, what? Like just the process itself, I want to try it. So
Right.
very tasty whiskey. It'll be available in the US very soon.
That's exciting, and somehow it maintains some degree of, and I'm also looking just off memory at this point, right? This is
Yeah.
9 months ago or whatever, but it's sort of like that ghost that you chase forever. But it still maintains that effervescence that comes with carbonation. Like I know it's not carbonated, but ginger can have that impact, right? Because it gives you that, I don't know, that experience on the tongue that feels like carbonation, but
it's like
it
uplifting.
feels like I took a whiskey and put a little bit of ginger beer in it, and I made myself a cocktail, but it's still straight whiskey at this point, and so it's dangerous. Like it's dangerous at that point. It's like I'm drinking a cocktail, but the cocktail is still at the bottle proof, which is going to be 80, 90, whatever proof it happens to come out.
I think it's like 96, that one.
Right, so 96. So it's a 96 proof cocktail. Like it's not diluted, but it tastes like a cocktail. It was fantastic.
Best old fashioned you can have though with that one. Ooh.
I would almost feel ashamed to do anything else to it besides that. But like, also drink whiskey however the fuck you want to.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that's the other side of it.
Yeah,
Like,
man, I couldn't believe how many distilleries down in Kentucky kept saying like you shouldn't drink Pappy 23 with rocks or with Coke or with ginger. I'm like, first of all, why are you talking about other brands on your tours? Second of all, why do you care like how people drink their whiskey?
What is it of your business? Like if it is my disposable income.
Yeah.
Like I can understand it. Like if I go to someone's house and they offer me something that feels special to them, and they say, I would really prefer if you didn't do it that way. Now, I'm not that way. Like somebody comes into this house and they say, I want to try whatever. I'm like, you can try whatever, with the exception of one or two things. There's a couple that I might be, bunkering for a long time just for a special occasion. But you want to mix it with Coke, man. Well, like whatever it's going to take. Like this is all meant to be drank, with the exception of those two bottles. Everything here has the top popped on it with the intent to consume it over time. And if someone's preferred method of consumption is different than that's fine. Like, I don't have to drink it your way and you don't have to drink it my way. But yeah, no, whiskey snobs get off on being like, oh, you can't, you don't drink it straight through with a Glencairn. Like, when you travel, do you have a Glencairn? Like what bar are you going to that normally has one?
Right. There are people that shockingly do that, but yeah, it's like you have like Booker No, for example. He drank everything with ginger. Like you listen to the Van Winkles, how they drink their whiskey. They put orange peel in it. Yeah.
With a twist. It is with a twist. Yeah.
Like,
that was the best part of that entire book. Like, so the Pappyland book that came out, the best part of that is just reading that specific line. Like, like his son goes into a bar and is like, I want, this is, I don't know, maybe it was Pappy, whatever, don't know.
Yeah.
With a twist. And they're like, how could you drink it that way? And he's like, this is my dad's whiskey. Like, this is my family. This is my name. This is how we drink it.
Yeah.
And nobody's going to believe him, obviously, because, if I'm in New York and that occurs in a bar, I'm going to be like, yeah, bullshit. You're not a Van Winkle. Get out of here. Yeah. You may have a fake ID or whatever, unless you're part of the whiskey verse and you're like, oh, no, I know exactly who that is.
That'll be one of our great podcasts. Wright Thompson and I have been ducking each other for a long time. On Thanksgiving of 2020, we had booked doing a podcast together. And then he's one of my favorite writers too. Like going back to like favorite writers, Wright Thompson, like guy has me in tears every time I listen to him on ESPN share one of his stories. So like eventually when we do it, I have many notes for him in that book about drinking whiskey and hanging out and hopefully having a good bottle together.
Do you feel so? Because Wright Thompson is not necessarily known for whiskey writing,
Hmm.
right? Like that's not his game. And I loved reading the book myself.
Oh, yeah.
Um, do you think that whenever somebody approached him about writing this, he's like, only if I get to drink good whiskey? Like, was that the motivating factor, or was it just because there is this incredible story that exists in Pappyland?
No, like so I first I heard about the book. I don't think he's even done with the book yet. He's on Dan Patrick's show talking about it. God, it must have been at least 2019, if not 2018.
Hmm.
Because he wasn't finished with the book yet. Because he said, the day I'll finish the book, I'll come in and drink a 15-year-old Pappy with you in studio. I don't think they ever did that, but I think it was for him that lost connection he had with his dad and
Hmm.
recognizing that inside the Van Winkle family is about carrying on this legacy, and he could do it through a family of the South, which obviously he's so connected to. And I don't think drinking Pappy 15, 2023 had anything to do with it. I think it was about sharing the story between a father and a son, and then another father and a son, and continuing that legacy down the line, which he doesn't,
Hmm.
he's kind of trying to do for his own kids.
Yep. Yeah, it's fantastic. So, all right, we're at 2 hours and 20 minutes, and
Nice. We did it.
I'm sure you have to work in the morning. I have to work in the morning.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there anything that you wanted to cover that we didn't cover across tonight?
I feel like we hit it all. I just thanks for the outlet. Thanks for everybody who listened.
Yeah,
Yeah, go buy Starward. You can buy it at starward.com. Follow us on the old social medias. Octave is our newest release. I think it's the best thing we put out as a distillery. If you can
so it
get
is
your hands,
octave, not octave as in music, but octave is what
it's
we're
kind
doing.
of a play on that.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah. Whatever. I'll leave the story there. Um,
that's fine.
Yeah, but delicious whiskey. We only have like I think 1,300 bottles in the US. So kind of hard to find, but we still have some available. We just released it about a month ago. Great whiskey. More things coming out like ginger beer cask and also unexpeded, which is a Nova finished inside of some Isla Scotch barrels from one distillery that I'm legally not allowed to say, but it's a prominent one that might feature the face of a comedic actor sometimes.
Well, what you can do, here's what you can do, right? Is you can't disclose what the distillery is, but you could say, what page are they on the malt whiskey yearbook for
Ooh,
2022, right?
nice. I like that.
Um, yeah, I only have this because I did an episode 3 weeks ago with Scotch Malt Whiskey Society, Jenna from Scotch Malt
Mm,
Whiskey Society, and we were tasting through some bottles, and I didn't know that this book existed to be able to tell me, like I could get the correlation of who made what bottle from
yeah.
their particular selections, and so before we even got off done, having our conversation, I'm like Amazoning it up over here, trying to make sure the book's on its way so I can connect that. But see, now you've got a way where you can be like, we can't say who it is, but if I were to look on page 27,
There you go.
that's where it would be. It's not page 27. I don't know what page it is, but I know who you're talking about. And, you talk about podcast episodes, and this is one of the things that's always been super encouraging. And so if anybody's ever thinking about starting another whiskey podcast, because, that's what the world needs, is
It's
another
true.
whiskey podcast. But people are incredibly open. Like, when I reached out to you, you're just like, yeah, sure, no problem. And there's
Yeah.
really no reason you should. It's not going to necessarily push you forward a ton because it's not a huge platform, but largely people agree to it. But that particular man that might be on the cover of that bottle, that would be like a moonshot for me. Like, I would love to have that conversation. And it doesn't even have to be entirely about whiskey. He's got a bunch of really fantastic books.
Oh yeah.
Got a really incredible human being story that
Yeah.
exists, and he happens to like whiskey, so that just sort of kind of fits the vein of things.
Yeah. I mean, like his whole other job of being a craftsman, of being a woodworker, that could be like, it's a parallel right into the whiskey industry right there. So
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
you could go on that conversation and go forever and be like, oh, by the way, like you're on the one of the most successful comic or uh what can I think right now? But TV shows of all time.
Sitcom.
Yeah, sitcom. There we go.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. All right,
I've lost everything when it comes to streaming.
Yeah, we've got to stop now because I will keep going and you'll keep going and we'll end up it'll be 2 a.m. and both of us have jobs. Appreciate you for joining me tonight.
Yeah.
Anybody who wants to go out buy Starward bottles, go listen to Key in the Lake podcast. It's one of the best podcasts that exists out there. Even if I remove the whiskey nomenclature from it, it's just a great podcast. Period.
Oh, thanks.
Appreciate you for joining me tonight. We'll do our outro here. So thanks.
Thanks, John. This is awesome. Appreciate it.
No problem. So thanks for tuning in for this offering of the Embellish podcast. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform that you have to be consuming this on. Leave a comment if possible. Hit me up on social media. I can be found at www.embellishpod.com with all of my links, account, contact details, any of that stuff. I'll be back again next week with another new offering for you. So until then, cheers and thanks for hanging out.